The overhead projector hums in the empty screening room. Shadows dance across cream-coloured walls as celluloid spools through machinery that cost more than most houses. 7 people sit in chairs upholstered with Italian leather, watching images flicker across a screen large enough to swallow them whole. The film ends. Nobody speaks. Stanley Kubrick stands near the back wall, arms crossed, watching the executives watch the credits roll. His face reveals nothing. He has spent over 400 days filming what they just witnessed. He has reviewed every frame thousands of times. He knows what he has created. One executive clears his throat. Another checks his watch. The third stares at the blank screen as if still processing what he saw. 5 days later, Stanley Kubrick is dead. This is not a story about a film. This is a story about what happens when someone shows too much too clearly, even when wrapped in fiction and symbolism. This is about missing footage, sealed archives, and a director who spent his entire career obsessing over every detail except, perhaps, his own safety. My name does not matter. What matters is that I am connected to Kubrick through family lines distant enough that we never met, but close enough that I inherited boxes of materials nobody else wanted. What matters is that I spent 3 years following a trail that leads to locked vaults, nervous former crew members, and questions that powerful people prefer remain unasked. What matters is that Stanley Kubrick may have been killed for making a movie, but to understand why, you need to understand who he was, not the myth, not the legend. The man who saw patterns where others saw chaos, who turned cameras into weapons of revelation, and who believed that truth could hide in plain sight if dressed in enough layers of artistic protection. You need to understand what he was trying to show us, and why someone might have decided he needed to be stopped. Chapter 1. The Relative Who Never Asked. Questions. I grew up hearing stories about the famous relative. Thanksgiving dinners included anecdotes told in hushed, reverent tones. The uncle who worked on a Kubrick film and spent 6 weeks filming a single scene. The cousin who delivered equipment to his estate and was required to sign documents thicker than phone books. The grandmother who remembered him as a quiet boy with a camera, always watching, always calculating angles. Stanley Kubrick was family mythology, a name invoked with equal parts pride and discomfort. Nobody quite knew what to make of him. Brilliant, certainly. Difficult, absolutely. Paranoid, perhaps necessarily so. The stories painted a portrait of someone fundamentally different from normal people. He did not simply make films, he constructed alternate realities with the precision of an engineer and the vision of a prophet. Every frame was calculated, every sound was intentional, every choice served purposes that often became clear only years after a film's release. My father told me about visiting the set of The Shining in 1978. He was there for less than an hour, delivering some family photographs Kubrick had requested. Even that brief exposure left an impression that lasted decades. He was filming the same scene over and over, my father recalled. The actress looked exhausted. The crew looked exhausted. But Stanley just kept watching, kept adjusting, kept demanding another take. I asked someone what he was looking for. They said nobody knew. He would recognize it when he saw it, but he could not explain it beforehand. That was Stanley Kubrick, a man chasing perfection he could identify but not articulate, a man convinced that truth existed in precise combinations of light, sound, movement, and timing, a man willing to destroy everyone around him, including himself, in pursuit of that truth. I was 17 when he died. The news reached our family through private channels before it hit the media. My father took the call in his study, door closed, voice low. When he emerged, his face carried an expression I had never seen before. Not grief exactly. Something closer to unease. He finished the film, my father said to my mother. He showed it to them, and then he was gone. My mother, who rarely involved herself in family gossip, paused with her coffee cup halfway to her lips. How quickly? Days? They looked at each other with the kind of shared understanding that comes from decades of marriage. Neither said what they were both thinking, neither needed to. My mother set down her cup carefully, as if afraid sudden movement might shatter something fragile. Which film was it? The one about the masks, my father said. The one he spent years researching. Something passed between them then. A recognition I was too young to understand. My mother's face went very still. My father looked away first. We should send flowers, my mother said finally. We should, my father agreed, but they never did. And when I asked why, years later, my father just shook his head. Some deaths are better mourned privately, he said. Some questions are better left unasked. I did not think much about it at the time. I was a teenager, absorbed in my own world. Stanley Kubrick was a name, a piece of family history, a photograph in a frame. His death seemed sad but distant, the way all deaths of relatives you never knew feel sad but distant. It was not until 12 years later, when the boxes arrived, that I understood what my parents had been thinking in that moment. It was not grief that made them uncomfortable. It was fear. Fear that asking questions might draw attention. Fear that looking too closely might reveal things better left hidden. Fear that even discussing Stanley Kubrick's final film might connect them to something dangerous. They were right to be afraid. I just did not know it yet. Chapter 2. The Locked Archive. The estate settlement took over a decade. Kubrick had been methodical about his work, but less organised about his personal affairs. Properties, materials, rights, residuals, everything tangled in legal proceedings that moved with glacial slowness through multiple jurisdictions. The delay itself was unusual. Kubrick had been wealthy, but his estate was not particularly complex by Hollywood standards. There were properties, film rights, personal effects, nothing that should have required a decade of legal manoeuvring. But every attempt to settle things quickly met resistance. Documents went missing. Lawyers discovered new complications. Courts required additional reviews. The process dragged on year after year, as if someone was deliberately slowing everything down. I received notification that I was entitled to archival materials, not film footage or anything commercially valuable, just boxes, research materials, the letter explained, personal notes, items of sentimental or historical interest, but no market value. The letter came from a law firm I had never heard of, based in Luxembourg. It was brief, formal, and included instructions for claiming the materials. I had 30 days to respond. If I did not respond, the materials would be destroyed. Destroyed, not donated, not archived, destroyed. That word caught my attention. Why destroy research materials? Why not offer them to film schools or museums? Why the urgency? I almost declined them. I lived in a small apartment. I had no particular interest in Kubrick beyond the family connection. But something, perhaps curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, made me accept. The response process was elaborate. I had to provide proof of identity, proof of family connection, and signatures on multiple documents. The documents included non-disclosure agreements, liability waivers, and acknowledgements that I understood the materials were being provided as is, with no guarantees about content or completeness. One clause stood out. Recipient acknowledges that materials may contain sensitive information and agrees to exercise discretion in their use or discussion. Sensitive information. In research materials for films made decades ago. What could possibly be sensitive about a dead director's notes? I signed everything. 6 weeks later, the boxes arrived. They came via private courier on a Tuesday afternoon in March. The courier required my signature, my identification, and a photograph of me holding the delivery receipt. He watched me carry the boxes inside before leaving, as if ensuring I actually took possession. 6 boxes, each professionally sealed with tamper-evident tape and labelled with coded identifiers that meant nothing to me. They were heavier than I expected, dense with paper. I stacked them in my spare bedroom and told myself I would go through them eventually. Eventually became that weekend. I could not stop thinking about them. 6 boxes of materials someone thought important enough to preserve but dangerous enough to nearly destroy. 6 boxes that required legal agreements and private couriers and elaborate verification procedures. I opened the first box expecting photographs or letters. Instead, I found production notebooks. Hundreds of pages of handwritten notes, sketches, calculations. reference materials clipped from newspapers and magazines, photocopied pages from books, some in English, some in languages I did not recognise. The handwriting was dense, cramped, urgent. Kubrick wrote like someone trying to capture thoughts faster than they could form. Abbreviations, symbols, arrows connecting concepts across pages. It was the handwriting of obsession. The second box contained more of the same, but organised differently. These notes were categorised by symbol rather than project name. A triangle meant one thing. A circle with a dot meant another. A spiral indicated something else entirely. I had no key to decode them, but certain symbols appeared repeatedly. A triangle inside a circle, a spiral with 7 turns, a mask, divided vertically into light and dark halves. These symbols were drawn with particular care, as if they carried meaning beyond mere organisational convenience. The third box stopped me cold. It was filled with research materials about secret societies, not popular books you could buy at any bookstore, rare texts, academic papers published by obscure university presses, photocopied pages from volumes held in private collections, documents that looked like they came from archives that should not have allowed photocopying. Annotations in Kubrick's handwriting covered the margins, underlines, question marks, arrows connecting concepts across different sources, but also something else, numbers, dates, locations, as if he was not just researching concepts but documenting actual events. One folder was labelled only with a date, November 1996. The date Eyes Wide Shut began filming. Inside were photographs, not production stills, not anything related to filmmaking. Photographs of buildings, European estates, ballrooms, gardens, architectural details captured from angles that suggested the photographer had not asked permission. Each photograph had notes on the back, address, historical details, current ownership when available, and in several cases a single word: confirmed. Confirmed. As if Kubrick had been verifying something. As if the photographs were evidence rather than inspiration. I spread them across my floor and stared at them for an hour. These were not random buildings. They were specific places, and Kubrick had documented them with the precision of an intelligence operative. The fourth box contained correspondence, letters from researchers, academics, historians, people responding to Kubrick's inquiries about obscure topics. Many letters included phrases like, "per your confidential request," or, "as discussed, this information should remain private." One letter, dated 3 months before filming began, came from a professor of European history at Cambridge. It read, "Mr. Kubrick, I have completed the research you requested regarding aristocratic ceremonial traditions in Austria and Italy during the 18th and 19th centuries. As you suspected, the practices you described do have historical precedent. I have enclosed copies of relevant documents, though I must note that some of these materials are restricted and should not be copied further. The families involved maintain these traditions privately and would not appreciate external documentation. I trust you will use this information discreetly. I will not be available for further consultation on this matter." The documents the professor mentioned were not in the box. Either Kubrick had stored them elsewhere, or someone had removed them before the boxes reached me. The fifth box was different. It contained newspaper clippings, hundreds of them, dating back decades. Most were society page mentions, brief items about exclusive events, photographs from charity, galas, announcements of private gatherings at estates whose names meant nothing to me. But Kubrick had highlighted certain details, names, dates, locations, and he had cross-referenced them. Lines drawn in red ink connected people across different events, different decades, different countries. He was mapping something, a network, a pattern. One clipping from 1973 showed a masked ball at an Austrian estate. The caption listed several attendees. Kubrick had circled 3 names and written beside them, "Confirmed attendees, all present at subsequent gatherings, pattern holds." Pattern holds. As if he had been tracking these people, as if their attendance at certain events proved something. The 6th box was the most disturbing. It contained medical records, not Kubrick's own. Records belonging to other people, with names redacted, documents from psychiatric facilities, police reports about unexplained deaths, news articles about people who had disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances. Each document was marked with a date and a single word. After. After what? After they attended certain gatherings? After they spoke about things they should not have spoken about? After they crossed lines they should not have crossed? One police report described a man who died falling from a hotel window in Paris. The death was ruled suicide. Kubrick had written in the margin, 3 weeks after the Vienna gathering, 5th similar incident in 2 years. I sat surrounded by these materials for hours. The apartment grew dark around me. I did not turn on lights. I just sat there, trying to process what I was seeing. Stanley Kubrick had not been making a film. He had been conducting an investigation. He had compiled evidence. He had documented patterns. He had tracked powerful people and the events they attended and the things that happened to people who got too close to their secrets. And then he had wrapped all of that evidence in fiction and put it on, screened for millions of people to see. No wonder he was dead. Chapter 3. The film that took too long. Production on Eyes Wide Shut officially began in November 1996. Stanley Kubrick had spent years developing the project, adapting a novella written in 1926 by Arthur Schnitzler. The story was nearly 70 years old. The themes were timeless. But the film Kubrick was making bore little resemblance to Schnitzler's novella. He had taken the basic framework, a doctor's journey through a night of sexual and social transgression, and transformed it into something far more ambitious, far more dangerous. Kubrick assembled his cast with characteristic precision. Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman, then Hollywood royalty, agreed to extended shooting schedules. They knew Kubrick's reputation. They knew what they were signing up for, or thought they did. But nobody could have anticipated how the production would consume them. Filming was supposed to take 6 months. It took over a year. 400 days of shooting. Longer than most directors spend making 3 films. Long enough that crew members joked they were living in purgatory, trapped in an endless loop of retakes and adjustments. Actors described shoots that drained them emotionally in ways they struggled to articulate. Scenes repeated dozens of times with no explanation given for why previous takes were insufficient. Kubrick watched, directed, adjusted lighting by fractions of degrees, then started again. Nicole Kidman later described the experience as unlike anything else in her career. Not difficult in the traditional sense, difficult in a way that felt purposeful, as if Kubrick was searching for something specific in each performance, something he would recognise only when he saw it. He was looking for truth, she said in an interview years later. Not dramatic truth, real truth. He wanted us to stop acting and start being. But he could never explain what being meant. You just kept trying until he nodded. Tom Cruise spoke less publicly about the production, but crew members noticed changes in him as filming progressed. He became quieter, more withdrawn. He studied Kubrick's direction with intensity that bordered on obsession, as if trying to understand not just what was being asked of him, but why it was being asked. One crew member told me that Cruise started arriving hours early to study the sets. He would walk through the spaces, touching surfaces, examining details. He was trying to understand what Stanley was building, they said, not just the physical sets, but what they represented. The shoot dragged on. Months passed. Studio executives grew concerned. Kubrick had final cut approval, a privilege almost unheard of in modern Hollywood. But even that protection came with the limits. Money was being spent, schedules were being disrupted, other projects waited in queue. Warner Brothers sent representatives to check on progress. They returned with vague reports. Filming was proceeding. The material looked good, but nobody could say when it would be finished. Kubrick ignored the pressure. He had ignored pressure his entire career. He filmed what needed to be filmed, for as long as it needed to be filmed, until he was satisfied. But this time was different. This time the delays felt intentional, as if he was stalling. as if he knew what would happen when the film was finished and wanted to postpone that moment as long as possible. In my boxes, I found production schedules marked with his annotations. Scenes that were supposed to take 3 days took 3 weeks. One sequence was filmed over 40 times. Kubrick's notes beside it read only, "Not yet authentic." Authenticity mattered more than anything else to him. More than schedule, more than budget, more than the comfort of his cast or the patience of his financiers. The question that haunted me as I read through these materials was simple. Authentic to what? What was Kubrick trying to recreate with such precision? What standard was he measuring his work against? What template existed in his mind or in his research that demanded such exactitude? One production assistant's diary, which somehow ended up in my collection, provided a clue. The entry, dated 8 months into production, read, "Stanley spent 3 hours today adjusting the position of candles in the ritual chamber. 3 hours, moving them inches at a time, checking the light, checking the shadows, checking how they reflected off the masks." One of the electricians asked what he was looking for. Stanley said, "I have photographs. It needs to match the photographs." What photographs? Nobody knows. But Stanley has them, and he is recreating whatever they show with absolute precision. Photographs, evidence, documentation of something real that Kubrick was rebuilding frame by frame. The ritual sequence at the heart of Eyes Wide Shut was not imagination. It was reconstruction, and the delay in filming was Kubrick's attempt to get every detail perfect, to match his evidence so precisely that anyone who had been to the real gatherings would recognize what they were seeing. He wanted them to know that he knew. He wanted them to understand that their secrets were no longer secret, that fiction could expose what journalism could not, and he wanted that exposure to be undeniable, perfect, authentic enough that they could not dismiss it as fantasy. The question was whether they would let him show it. Chapter 4. The Research Phase. Stanley Kubrick did not make films casually. Every project began with research that would humble most doctoral candidates. He read voraciously, consulted experts, accumulated materials that filled rooms. For Eyes Wide Shut, the research was different. It was not academic, it was investigative. The boxes I inherited contained dozens of books about secret societies, elite gatherings, aristocratic traditions that predated most modern nations. Some were academic, texts published by university presses. Others were privately printed volumes with no ISBN numbers, no publisher information, just text and binding. But the most revealing materials were his personal notes. Kubrick documented everything he learned with the meticulousness of a prosecutor building a case. Facts, sources, cross-references, verification notes. He studied the Hellfire Club, an 18th century British organisation whose members included politicians, artists and nobles. Founded by Francis Dashwood, the club met at Medmenham Abbey and later in caves beneath Dashwood's estate. Official records described it as a social club for drinking and debauchery. Unofficial accounts suggested darker purposes. Kubrick's notes focused on the ceremonial aspects, the costumes members wore, the rituals they performed, the architectural spaces they designed specifically for their gatherings. He collected engravings showing the caves, floor plans of Medmenham Abbey, descriptions of ceremonies. From members' correspondence, one note read, "Dashwood was Chancellor of the Exchequer. Members included cabinet ministers, members of Parliament, influential aristocrats. These were not fools or outcasts. These were people who ran the country. Yet they gathered in caves wearing robes and performing rituals nobody outside the club witnessed. Why? What purpose did ceremony serve for people who already had power?" He researched Bohemian Grove, the California retreat where powerful men gathered annually behind closed doors. This was not ancient history. Bohemian Grove still operated. Politicians, business leaders, artists, intellectuals, all gathering for 2 weeks every summer at a private campground surrounded by redwood trees. The official description portrayed it as relaxation and networking, theatrical performances, informal talks, bonding between influential men away from public scrutiny. But Kubrick focused on specific rituals. The cremation of care ceremony performed on the first, night, where a mock human sacrifice occurred before a 40-foot stone owl. The division of attendees into camps with names like Mandalay and Isle of Aves. The strict rules about who could attend and how membership was maintained across generations. His notes included photographs taken by journalists who had sneaked onto the property, images of men in robes, the massive owl statue, wooden stages built for performances in forest clearings, nothing explicitly sinister, just strange. Powerful men engaging in behaviour that made no sense if power was purely political or economic. Ritual creates cohesion, Kubrick wrote. Shared transgression creates loyalty. If you have witnessed something together, something you cannot speak about publicly, you are bound to everyone else who is present. This is not conspiracy. This is psychology. This is how elite groups maintain themselves across generations. He researched European aristocratic traditions, masquerade balls where nobles gathered, behind masks. These gatherings had centuries of history. The Venetian Carnival, the Viennese opera balls, events that were both public and private, where identity became fluid, where social hierarchies could be temporarily inverted or reinforced through ritual. His collection included books about 18th and 19th century Vienna, when the aristocracy gathered in palaces for events that lasted days. Masked balls where attendees' identities were supposedly secret, though everyone knew who everyone was. Ceremonies that blended Catholic ritual with older pagan traditions. Gatherings where sex, power, religion and theatre merged into experiences that defied easy categorization. One book, published in 1897, described these events in detail. Kubrick had highlighted specific passages. The participants arrive masked, their carriages depositing them at entrances designed to maintain privacy. Inside, they find spaces transformed by candlelight and decoration into realms unlike ordinary existence. Music plays continuously, wine flows freely. But beneath the apparent chaos lies careful choreography. Certain rooms are accessible only to certain guests. Specific ceremonies occur at specific times. Everyone understands the rules without them being stated explicitly. This is not mere entertainment. This is demonstration of membership in a world most people do not know exists. Kubrick's margin note. Same structure as modern equivalents. Same purposes, same functions. Power performs itself for itself. But the research went beyond historical analysis. Kubrick documented contemporary gatherings, society page mentions of exclusive events, private clubs that required invitation, networks that operated through personal connection rather than public membership. He cross-referenced names, tracked who attended what events, mapped relationships between people across different countries, different industries, different apparent power structures. He was not just researching secret societies. He was documenting how modern elites maintained cohesion through ceremonial gathering. And he was finding patterns. The same families appeared across generations. The same estates hosted events decades apart. The same symbols and rituals appeared in different contexts, different countries, different eras, as if the forms evolved while the underlying structure remained constant. One folder contained only names, hundreds of them. People from politics, finance, entertainment, aristocracy. Each name had dates beside it. Dates of gatherings they attended, events they were photographed at, clubs they belonged to. Kubrick had highlighted certain names in red. These people appeared repeatedly, across multiple decades, at gatherings in different countries. They were not celebrities. Most were people I had never heard of. But according to Kubrick's research, they were connected through participation in events the public never heard about. One highlighted name had a note beside it. Attended Vienna gathering 1974, 1978, 1982, 1986, 1990, 1994. Same estate, same ceremony, every 4 years. Currently serves on boards of 3 major banks and 2 government advisory committees. Fiction cannot invent what reality already provides. This was not research for a film. This was documentation of power structures operating through mechanisms the public did not see. Kubrick had compiled evidence that elite cohesion was maintained through ceremonial gathering, through shared ritual, through experiences that created bonds journalism could not penetrate. And he was planning to show it. Not as documentary, which would be dismissed or suppressed, as fiction, which provided protection through artistic license. He was going to dress the truth in drama and hope that costume was sufficient armour. It was not. Chapter 5. The missing footage. Studio records are curious things. They document everything. Film stock used, footage shot, hours logged, expenses incurred. The accounting is meticulous because studios are businesses, and businesses track their investments. According to records I was able to access through contacts in the industry, Eyes Wide Shut originally ran significantly longer than the version released to theatres. How much longer depended on which source you consulted. Some said 20 minutes, others said 40. One person who claimed to have worked in post-production suggested over an hour. The theatrical release ran 159 minutes. That meant somewhere between 1 and 4 reels of footage were cut before the public ever saw the film. This alone is not unusual. Films are edited. Scenes are removed for pacing, clarity, runtime requirements. Directors make choices about what serves the story and what does not. But Stanley Kubrick had final cut approval. He made those choices himself without studio interference. Every frame in a Kubrick film was there because he wanted it there. So why did the record show footage shot but not included? Why did production logs reference scenes that do not appear in any known version of the film? I started reaching out to people who worked on the production. Most did not respond. A few sent polite declinations, citing non-disclosure agreements they had signed decades ago. One person, an assistant editor whose name I will not share, agreed to speak with me off the record. We met at a coffee shop in North London. They were nervous, constantly glancing around as if worried about being observed. They asked me to leave my phone in my car. They would not let me take notes. There was more, they told me, significantly more. Scenes that went further. Not explicit, just more clear about what was being depicted. Stanley kept pushing, kept adding layers, kept building the ritual sequence until it felt overwhelming. I asked what happened to that footage. Sealed, they said. Archived somewhere with access restricted to about 4 people in the world. Maybe fewer now. I do not know where it is. I just know it exists, and that we were told very clearly it would never be released. Who told you that? They paused, stirring their coffee with a wooden stick, eyes unfocused. People who do not make suggestions. They make statements. They visited the edit suite twice. The first time they just watched, stood in the back of the room, said nothing, left after 20 minutes. But you could feel the temperature change. Everyone got very quiet. And the second time? The second time they brought documentation. Legal papers, something Stanley had signed years earlier apparently, agreements about how certain materials would be handled, requirements about what could be shown publicly. Stanley signed agreements limiting his own film. They looked at me with tired eyes. That is what they said. That Stanley had agreed to certain restrictions in exchange for funding. That some of the private investors had conditions about how their money could be used. I never saw the actual documents, but after they left, Stanley spent 3 hours in his editing room alone. When he came out, he looked 20 years older. What did he say? Nothing. He just handed us a list of scenes to remove. His handwriting was shaking. I had never seen his handwriting shake before. I asked what was in those scenes. More detail, more symbolism, more explicit connections to real events and real people. The ritual sequence in the theatrical version is abstract, masks and choreography and atmosphere, but the longer version showed more. Specific symbols that anyone familiar with certain organisations would recognise. Architectural details that match specific buildings. Costumes that reference specific historical ceremonies. So it was more obvious. It was undeniable. Stanley had built a perfect recreation of something real, down to the smallest detail. The longer version made it impossible to dismiss as invention. You watched it and you knew, even if you could not articulate how you knew, that you were seeing something true. We sat in silence for a moment. Rain started falling outside, speckling the windows. "Do you think they killed him?" I asked. They did not answer immediately, just stared at their coffee, at the foam dissolving into brown liquid, at patterns forming and reforming. "I think," they said slowly, "that Stanley knew exactly what he was doing. I think he knew the risks, and I think when he handed me that list of scenes to cut, he knew he was choosing between the film and his life. Why not just destroy the footage completely? Because Stanley was smart. He kept copies, multiple copies, stored in different locations with different people. He made sure enough people knew the footage existed that destroying him would not destroy the evidence. It was insurance. Then why is he dead?" They looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw genuine fear in their eyes. Because insurance only works if people believe you will use it. Stanley showed them the full version. He screened it for them. He made them watch what he had created, and I think they realised the insurance was a bluff, that Stanley had no way to release the footage without destroying himself, so they called his bluff. They stood up then, leaving their coffee unfinished. "Do not contact me again," they said. "Do not mention my name. Do not tell anyone we spoke. I have said more than I should have already." They walked out into the rain without looking back. I sat there for another hour trying to process what I had learned. Somewhere, in a vault protected by legal restrictions and institutional secrecy, the real version of Eyes Wide Shut existed. The version Stanley Kubrick risked everything to create. The version that showed too much, too clearly. And the only person who could have released it was dead. Chapter 6. The Executive Screening. March 1st, 1999. Stanley Kubrick screens the final cut of Eyes Wide Shut for Warner Brothers executives. This is standard procedure. The studio financing the film wants to see what they paid for before it reaches the public. The screening takes place at Kubrick's estate in Childwickbury, north of London. He prefers his own projection equipment, his own room, his own control over every environmental variable. The executives make the drive from London, arriving in the afternoon. 3 cars, 7 people, studio executives, lawyers, representatives from the private investors who provided additional funding. An unusually large group for a routine screening. I spoke with someone who was present that day, not an executive, not anyone with decision-making authority, someone on the periphery, there for technical support, watching the watchers rather than the film. Their account of that day has stayed with me through everything that followed. The atmosphere was tense before the screening even started, they told me. Stanley was different. Usually he was confident, almost arrogant about his work. He knew what he had created and he wanted you to know he knew. But that day he seemed watchful, alert, like he was waiting for something. The guests arrived and were shown to the screening room. Kubrick's estate was sprawling, maze-like, filled with collections and equipment and materials from decades of filmmaking. The screening room was small, intimate, just 20 seats, though only 7 would be occupied. Stanley insisted everyone turn off their phones, my source said. This was before that was common. Most people did not even have cell phones yet, but he made sure. No recording devices, no cameras, no way to document what they were about to see. The film played. My source could not see the screen from their position at the back of the room, operating projection equipment, but they could see faces. They could see reactions. About 10 minutes in, one of the executives shifted in his seat. Not much, just a slight movement. But I noticed because everyone else was perfectly still. Around the 30-minute mark, another executive leaned forward, as if studying something specific on screen. The ritual sequence began around the hour mark. In the theatrical version, it runs approximately 20 minutes. In the version screened that day, according to my source, it ran closer to 45 minutes. The room temperature changed, they said. I know that sounds strange, but you could feel it. The air got heavier. Nobody moved. Nobody coughed or shifted or did any of the normal things people do in screenings. They just watched. My source described one executive who removed his glasses and cleaned them 3 times during the sequence. Another who kept touching his tie, adjusting it though it was already perfect. Small gestures of discomfort, recognition perhaps, or fear. When the ritual sequence ended, one of them just stood up in the middle of the film. The others looked at him, but nobody said anything. He stood there for maybe 30 seconds, then sat back down. But his face was completely white. The film continued. The story played out its conclusion. Credits rolled. Nobody applauded. Nobody congratulated Kubrick on completing another masterpiece. They sat in silence that stretched uncomfortably long. Finally, one executive spoke. My source could not hear what was said, but they saw Kubrick's reaction. A slight nod. No emotion on his face. Just acknowledgement. Then one of the lawyers pulled out a document, my source remembered. Started reading from it. Stanley listened without interrupting. The lawyer spoke for maybe 5 minutes. Stanley nodded occasionally. When the lawyer finished, Stanley said something brief. I could not hear it, but whatever he said made everyone relax slightly. The executives left within 30 minutes of the screening ending. Brief handshakes, polite farewells, cars pulling away, down the long driveway. Stanley stood at the window watching them go, my source said. I asked if everything was all right. He said, "We will see." That was all, just, "We will see." My source helped pack up the projection equipment. They said Kubrick seemed distracted, distant, already thinking about something else. As I was leaving, he stopped me, put his hand on my shoulder. He had never touched me before, never been physically demonstrative in any way. But he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Thank you for your work, all of it. I hope you understand someday why it mattered." I did not understand what he meant. I just said thank you. He nodded and walked back into the house. That was the last time I saw him. 5 days later, Stanley Kubrick died in his sleep at his home. Heart attack, natural causes. He was 70 years old. My source paused for a long time after telling me this. We were sitting in their apartment in South London. Rain fell outside, the room was dim. "Do you think they killed him?" I asked. "I think," they said carefully, "that 7 people watched a film that revealed secrets they had spent lifetimes protecting. I think Stanley showed them he knew things nobody outside their circles should know. I think he demonstrated he could expose those things to millions of people through the vehicle of entertainment. And 5 days later he was dead. Draw your own conclusions." Chapter 7. The Official Cause. The official reports are straightforward. Stanley Kubrick suffered a heart attack in his sleep during the early morning hours of March 7th, 1999. He was discovered by his wife, Christiane. Emergency services were called at 6:47 in the morning. Paramedics arrived at 6:59. He was pronounced dead at the scene at 7:12. No autopsy was performed. At 70, with a history of heart issues, the cause of death was considered obvious and natural. No investigation was opened. No questions were raised publicly. The medical examiner who signed the death certificate did so based on external examination and medical history. Kubrick had high blood pressure. He had been treated for cardiac issues in the past. The circumstances of death suggested sudden cardiac arrest, common in men his age with his health profile. Everything was textbook. Everything was normal. Everything pointed to natural causes, except the timing. Kubrick had just finished his film after years of obsessive work. He had screened it for studio executives 5 days earlier. He was preparing for the final stages of post-production before release, and then he was gone. The official timeline raises questions if you look closely enough. March 1st, executive screening. March 2nd, no documented activity. Kubrick reportedly spent the day at home. March 3rd, no documented activity. March 4th, phone call with his longtime assistant recorded in phone logs. Duration 12 minutes. March 5th, no documented activity. March 6th, final journal entry, discovered weeks later. Brief notes about sound mixing decisions. March 7th, death. 5 days between the screening and death. 5 days during which Kubrick apparently did very little. No phone calls except one. No visitors except family. No work activity documented beyond a brief journal entry. For a man who obsessed over every detail of his films, who typically worked 18-hour days during post-production, who communicated constantly with editors and sound designers, and everyone involved in completing his vision, this silence is remarkable. What was he doing during those 5 days? I found a partial answer in my boxes. A letter, written by Kubrick, but apparently never sent. It was dated March 4th, 2 days after the screening, 3 days before his death. The letter was addressed to a name I did not recognise. The opening lines read, "I have made a terrible mistake, not in what I showed, but in believing I could show it safely. I thought fiction provided protection. I thought artistic license was armour. I thought they would understand I was not threatening them, merely observing them. I was wrong." The letter continued for 2 pages, but large portions were redacted. Black marker obscured whole paragraphs. Only fragments remained visible. Cannot release the full version now. Copies secured with instructions. If anything happens to me, the footage exists as insurance, but too late to pull back. Finishing what was started. The letter ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as if Kubrick had stopped writing and never returned to complete it. I showed this letter to a forensic document examiner. They confirmed the handwriting was consistent with Kubrick's other writings. They noted the ink showed slight variations in pressure and flow, suggesting emotional distress or physical tremor during writing. They pointed out corrections and crossouts indicating the writer was struggling to find precise language. This is not a casual letter, they told me. This is someone writing under significant stress, trying to communicate something important, but unable to commit it fully to paper. The incomplete sentences, the stopped ending. This suggests either the writer was interrupted or could not bring themselves to finish. But who redacted it? Who marked through paragraphs with heavy black ink? And why did this letter end up in boxes supposedly containing only innocuous research materials? The official cause of death says nothing about fear, nothing about pressure, nothing about a man who realised 5 days before he died that he had made himself a target. It says heart attack, natural causes, unfortunate timing but medically unremarkable. And maybe that is all it was. Maybe the stress of completing the film after years of work simply overtook a body already compromised by age and health issues. Maybe there is no mystery beyond tragic coincidence, but then, why did Kubrick write a letter describing a terrible mistake? Why did he mention copies secured with instructions? Why did he reference things happening to him, as if anticipating his own death? And why, 3 days after writing those words, did his heart stop beating? Chapter 8. Industry silence. I spent 6 months tracking down people who worked on Eyes Wide Shut. Crew members, assistants, technicians, anyone who might speak about their experience. I sent emails, made phone calls, showed up at offices and homes. I was polite but persistent. The response was nearly uniform. Polite refusal. Non-disclosure agreements explained some of the silence. Kubrick's productions operated under strict confidentiality. Contracts included clauses that extended decades beyond completion. Breaking them meant legal consequences most people could not afford. Standard practice for high-profile films. Nothing unusual about protecting intellectual property and maintaining privacy during production. But this silence felt different. It felt enforced. One cinematographer I contacted agreed to meet for coffee. We set a time and place. I arrived 15 minutes early. They did not show. I waited for an hour. No message, no explanation. When I called later, their number was disconnected. Another crew member initially seemed willing to share stories. We exchanged several emails. They described the atmosphere on set, Kubrick's working methods, the challenge of the long production schedule, harmless anecdotes, professional observations, nothing controversial. Then I asked about the final weeks of filming, specifically about the ritual sequence and how Kubrick directed those scenes. The emails stopped. No response. I sent follow-ups. Nothing. I tried calling, straight to voicemail. Eventually I drove to the address they had mentioned once in passing. The house was empty. A neighbour said they had moved suddenly months ago, left no forwarding information. A costume designer responded to my inquiry with a single line. Some things are better left in the past. When I wrote back asking what things specifically, they replied with just, all of it. The pattern repeated itself dozens of times. Initial willingness followed by sudden withdrawal. Friendly responses turning cold. People who seemed eager to talk about their experiences suddenly deciding they had nothing to say. I was not asking about anything illegal. I was not threatening anyone. I was simply trying to understand what happened during the production of a film made decades ago. Standard research for any serious film history project. But the doors kept closing. The few who did speak did so with careful ambiguity. They praised Kubrick's genius in abstract terms. They described the production as challenging but rewarding. They offered nothing substantive about the film's content, the atmosphere during final filming, or the circumstances surrounding Kubrick's death. They spoke like people who'd been trained in what not to say. One production coordinator agreed to meet me at a restaurant in Chelsea. They were nervous from the moment they arrived, kept glancing at other tables, spoke quietly even though nobody was sitting near us. "I need to be clear," they said before I could ask any questions. "I will not discuss specific content. I will not describe specific scenes. I will not name other people who worked on the film, and nothing I say can be attributed to me by name." I agreed to their terms. Stanley was different during Eyes Wide Shut, they told me. I worked on 2 of his previous films. This one felt different from the first day. He was more secretive, more controlling, more paranoid about who had access to what. Paranoid how? Sets were closed even to people who normally would have full access. Certain scenes were filmed with minimal crew. Stanley personally controlled all footage. Usually multiple copies get made for various purposes. This time everything went through him directly. He supervised every transfer, every backup, every moment footage left the camera. Why? They shrugged. He never explained. But you could feel the tension, like we were all part of something that needed protection, like the film itself was dangerous. Dangerous to who? To everyone involved. Stanley made us all sign additional agreements beyond the standard non-disclosure contracts. Documents that included specific language about not discussing certain aspects of production, even decades after release. They were more detailed than anything I had seen before, more aggressive. Did you read them carefully? Of course. That is when I realised this was not normal filmmaking. The language included provisions about permanent silence on specific topics, financial penalties that would bankrupt most people, even criminal liability clauses under certain circumstances. Criminal liability for talking about making a movie, for revealing what the movie was actually depicting, for connecting it to real people or real events, for suggesting it was anything other than pure fiction. They paused, picked at their food without eating. I remember thinking it was overkill. Kubrick being Kubrick, taking everything to extremes. But now, looking back, I think he knew what was coming. I think he knew making this film would have consequences, and he wanted to make sure those consequences fell on him alone, not on everyone who helped him. Do you think he was killed? They looked at me for a long moment. Rain started falling outside. The sound against the windows filled the silence between us. I think Stanley Kubrick spent years investigating things powerful people prefer remain hidden. I think he compiled evidence that should not exist. I think he built that evidence into a film disguised as entertainment, and I think the people he exposed in that film made sure he could never make another one. That is a serious accusation. It is, which is why you will never hear me say it publicly, which is why I will deny this conversation if you try to use it, which is why I am leaving now and asking you never to contact me again. They stood up, left money for their meal and walked out. I sat there alone, surrounded by the quiet sounds of other people's conversations, and realised everyone connected to Eyes Wide Shut lived in a similar space, unable to speak openly, unable to share what they knew, trapped between legal obligations and something that felt like fear. The silence was not coincidence, it was coordination. Someone had ensured that everyone who worked on Stanley Kubrick's final film understood the consequences of talking, and that someone had enough power to make those consequences stick. Chapter 9. The altered final cut film preservation organisations maintain detailed records, frame counts, edit patterns, technical specifications. These records allow future restorations, ensure archival accuracy, document artistic intent. I obtained records from multiple sources documenting the version of Eyes Wide Shut that Stanley Kubrick screened for executives versus the version released to theatres 4 months after his death. The comparison revealed systematic alterations. The theatrical release was shorter by 23 minutes. Specific sequences had been trimmed. The pacing had been adjusted to feel less dense, less overwhelming. Most significantly, digital alterations had been added to obscure certain imagery. In the theatrical version, portions of the ritual sequence were modified using computer-generated figures. These figures, created through early digital effects, appeared to walk through the frame, blocking the camera's view of activities happening in the background. The effect was obvious to anyone looking for it. Strange, artificial-looking people randomly obscuring the action. The official explanation was ratings compliance. Without those digital insertions, the film would have received an NC-17 rating, limiting its theatrical release and commercial viability. The modifications allowed the film to receive an R rating while preserving Kubrick's artistic vision as much as possible. Except Kubrick did not create those modifications. He died before they were added, and according to people I spoke with who worked in post-production, Kubrick had already planned for ratings requirements. He had shot the ritual sequence knowing certain elements would need adjustment. He had alternate takes. He had coverage that provided options for editing around problematic content. He did not need digital figures randomly walking through the frame. That solution was clumsy, obvious, artistically inferior to approaches Kubrick would have taken. So why was that method chosen? I found notes in Kubrick's handwriting analysing the ritual sequence shot by shot. These notes were technical, describing camera angles, lighting choices, symbolic elements embedded in the mise-en-scene, but they also included references to specific visual details. One note read, "Symbol above entrance to chamber matches engraving in the Rothschild estate, photographed 1993 during research trip, must be clearly visible in master shot for those who recognise it." Another, "Costume design for central figure replicates garments worn at Vienna ceremony, 1887, documented in private collection photographs. Details include specific mask style, colour combinations, ceremonial staff. Audience will not recognise, but participants will." He was embedding evidence in the visual landscape of the film, details that meant nothing to general audiences but would be unmistakable to anyone who had attended similar gatherings. The digital alterations added posthumously obscured many of these details. Symbols were blocked. Costume elements were hidden. Specific architectural features became less visible. The modifications were not about ratings. They were about removing evidence. I compared Kubrick's shot-by-shot notes to the theatrical release. Many of the elements he specifically mentioned ensuring were visible had been obscured or cut entirely. Scenes he analysed in detail were shortened or removed. The cumulative effect was to preserve the atmosphere of the ritual sequence while stripping away the specific details that connected it to reality. Someone had gone through Kubrick's final cut with his own notes as reference, and systematically removed everything that made the fiction too close to truth. The question was who had access to both the film and Kubrick's private notes. I spent weeks investigating the post-production timeline. After Kubrick's death, the film went through several months of additional work before release. Warner Brothers claimed they were completing Kubrick's vision based on detailed notes he had left. But my research suggested something different. Multiple editors worked on the film after his death. New supervisors were brought in, people who had not been part of the original. Production suddenly had access to footage and decision-making authority. One of these people had worked previously for a private security and consulting firm that specialised in reputation management for high-net-worth clients. Their filmography included almost nothing else. They appeared for Eyes Wide Shut, worked on it for 3 months, then disappeared from the industry entirely. Another supervisor had connections to legal firms that represented several of the private investors who helped fund the film. Not direct employment, but documented associations, board memberships, advisory positions, relationships that suggested alignment of interests. These people oversaw the final cut. They made decisions about what to keep and what to alter. They added the digital modifications. They trimmed the runtime. They transformed Kubrick's final film into something safer, and they did it all under the cover of completing a dead director's vision. The theatrical release is still powerful, still disturbing, still provocative, but it lacks the precision of evidence. The specific details that would have made it not just entertainment but documentation have been carefully removed. What audiences saw was fiction. What Kubrick created was testimony, and someone made sure only the fiction survived. Chapter 10. The Symbolism Trail. Stanley Kubrick was a filmmaker who thought in symbols. Every image carried meaning. Every choice served multiple purposes. Nothing was accidental. In his notes about Eyes Wide Shut, he wrote extensively about the symbolic language he was employing. But unlike his previous films, where symbols served thematic purposes, this time they served evidentiary ones. He was not using symbols to suggest ideas. He was using them to document realities. Masks, in Kubrick's analysis, were not metaphors for hidden identity. They were literal tools used in actual gatherings to create specific psychological conditions. By wearing masks, participants could shed social identities and embrace private natures without consequences. The mask provided permission. It created a liminal space where normal rules did not apply. Throughout history, Kubrick wrote, elite gatherings have used masks to facilitate behaviours that would be unacceptable in daylight. The Venetian Carnival allowed aristocrats to mingle with commoners anonymously. The masquerade balls of European nobility permitted sexual liaisons across class boundaries. Modern equivalents serve similar functions. The mask grants freedom from consequence. He researched specific mask traditions across centuries. The Venetian borta, which covered the full face and included a chin extension allowing the wearer to eat and drink without removal. The Moretta, a black oval mask worn by women, held in place by a button clenched in the teeth, forcing silence. The Volto, a full-face mask often worn with a tricorn hat and cloak, completely obscuring identity. Each tradition had rules, each served specific purposes, each created different psychological effects on both wearer and observer. The masks in Eyes Wide Shut combined elements from multiple traditions. Full-face coverage from Venetian styles, elaborate decoration from French court masquerades, symbolic imagery from ceremonial orders and secret societies. They were not simple disguises. They were composite artifacts encoding centuries of elite ritual practice. Kubrick's costume designer later described the research process as unlike anything else in their career. Stanley provided reference materials I'd never seen. Photographs of masks from private collections, sketches from historical documents, descriptions of ceremonial garments used in gatherings nobody photographs. He wanted everything to be authentic, not to general history but to specific traditions. The ritual choreography followed similar principles. Kubrick researched how power demonstrates itself through ceremony. The careful positioning of participants to indicate hierarchy. The use of music and chant to create trance states. The orchestration of movement to reinforce group cohesion while maintaining individual subordination. He studied Masonic rituals, which use symbolic drama to convey philosophical principles and reinforce organizational structure. He analyzed Catholic ceremony, where elaborate staging creates atmosphere of transcendence and mystery. He examined military pageantry, where synchronized movement demonstrates discipline and unity. But he also studied less public examples, initiation ceremonies for exclusive clubs, secret society gatherings documented in historical accounts, modern equivalents captured in leaked photographs and descriptions from participants who later spoke publicly. One folder in my boxes contained notes on the cremation of care ceremony, performed annually at Bohemian Grove. Kubrick had collected multiple descriptions of this event, cross-referenced them, identified consistent elements across decades of performances. A mock-human sacrifice, he wrote, performed before a 40-foot owl representing wisdom or knowledge. Participants wear robes. Music plays from hidden speakers to seem sourceless and otherworldly. Fire consumes an effigy while a high priest figure reads from a script. The ceremony ends with proclaiming that care has been banished, allowing participants to enjoy the following 2 weeks without worry or conscience. His notes continued, "This is not satanic. This is not worship of evil entities. This is psychological theatre designed to create emotional permission. The ceremony tells powerful men they can set aside normal ethical constraints. It provides ritualistic justification for behaving during the gathering in ways they could not justify in regular life. The symbolism matters less than the psychological effect. The ritual in Eyes Wide Shut served similar functions. It demonstrated hierarchy through positioning. It created permission through symbolic transgression. It reinforced group cohesion through shared experience of something unspeakable to outsiders. Kubrick embedded specific symbols throughout the sequence. A triangle inside a circle above the entrance, a spiral with 7 turns carved into the floor. Masks divided vertically into light and dark halves. Each symbol had precedent in actual ceremonial traditions. One symbol appeared repeatedly, a stylized owl with spread wings, similar to the Bohemian Grove owl, but with subtle differences. Kubrick's note beside a sketch of this owl read, "Adapted from multiple sources, general enough to avoid direct identification, specific enough to trigger recognition in those familiar with various manifestations." He was walking a line, making the symbols recognizable without making them exact replicas, allowing those who had seen the real ceremonies to understand what they were watching, without providing evidence definitive enough for legal challenge. Art as testimony requires careful calibration. Too abstract and the truth disappears, too specific and the consequences become unmanageable. Kubrick believed he had found the balance. Events would prove he had not. Chapter 11. The Surveillance. Fear, paranoia was Stanley Kubrick's default state. He controlled every aspect of his productions because he trusted no one else to maintain his standards. He lived reclusively because public exposure made him uncomfortable. He communicated through intermediaries because direct interaction felt too risky. His longtime assistant described his baseline level of caution as extraordinary even by Hollywood standards. He vetted everyone who worked with him extensively. He required multiple layers of approval for anyone accessing his property. He maintained physical and legal barriers between himself and the outside world. But according to multiple sources, his paranoia intensified dramatically during the final months of Eyes Wide Shut production. A friend who visited the estate during this period described new security measures that went beyond Kubrick's normal precautions. Additional cameras covered the grounds from angles that suggested concern about more than random trespassers. Motion sensors in places that made little sense for standard security. Electronic countermeasures installed in his editing room that could detect surveillance equipment. Stanley always valued privacy, a friend told me, but this was different. This felt like preparation for siege, like he expected someone to try accessing the property or the footage or him personally. Phone logs from this period show a dramatic decrease in outgoing calls. Kubrick, who typically made dozens of calls per day coordinating various aspects of production, was suddenly making only a handful. And those calls were brief, often just minutes long. Letters from this time show similar changes. Kubrick's correspondence became guarded, filled with vague references rather than specific details. He stopped, discussing the film except in the most general terms. One letter to a longtime colleague included a passage that stands out in retrospect. "I find myself thinking about those artists throughout history who revealed too much through their work. Artemisia Gentileschi painting Judith beheading Holofernes with such visceral intensity that scholars still debate whether she was processing trauma or issuing warning. Goya creating his black paintings depicting nightmares of power and corruption directly onto his walls, never intending public viewing but unable to stop himself from documenting what he witnessed. Caravaggio fleeing Rome after his work exposed the violent underbelly of religious authority." The letter continued. "Art allows us to show what cannot be said directly, but there is a limit to how much truth art can carry before it becomes dangerous not just to the audience but to the artist. Each revelation creates risk. Each truth depicted increases the probability of consequences. I worry I may have found that limit." This was not abstract philosophical musing. This was a man recognizing he had crossed a boundary from which retreat was impossible. Staff members noticed changes in Kubrick's behavior. He began varying his routines, which had been rigidly consistent for decades. He started checking his car before driving, looking underneath and in the wheel wells as if searching for devices. He asked his driver to vary routes to and from London. These are behaviours common among people who believe they are under surveillance. People who think someone is tracking their movements and habits. One security consultant who worked at the estate described being asked to sweep Kubrick's private office for listening devices. This was not standard practice. Kubrick had never requested such service before. I swept the office 3 times, the consultant told me. Found nothing. Told him the space was clean, but he was not satisfied. Kept asking if I was certain if my equipment was sophisticated enough, if someone with government-level resources could plant something my scanners would miss. Could they? I asked. Theoretically, yes. If you have military or intelligence-grade surveillance technology, you can plant devices that standard commercial scanners will not detect. But why would anyone use that level of resource on a film director? Unless, I said, he was threatening something that justified that level of response. The consultant nodded slowly. That is what I wondered. But I did not ask. I just swept his office again with more advanced equipment borrowed from a contact. Still found nothing. But Stanley remained convinced someone was listening. The fear was not unfounded if the research materials in my boxes are any indication. Kubrick had compiled evidence about gatherings attended by people with extraordinary resources, politicians who controlled intelligence agencies, business leaders who owned security companies, individuals with the means and motivation to monitor threats to their privacy. If even one of those people learned what Kubrick was planning, they would have the capability to watch him, to track his communications, to understand exactly how much he knew and what he intended to do with that knowledge. And Kubrick, with his obsessive attention to detail and his understanding of how power operates, would have recognized the signs of surveillance, would have noticed the small inconsistencies that indicated his privacy was being violated. In his final journal entry, written 3 days before his death, he included a line that seemed paranoid at the time but reads differently in context. They have been watching. I know they have. The question is no longer whether they know what I have done. The question is what they will do about it. 2 days later, Kubrick wrote the letter I found in my boxes. The letter describing a terrible mistake. The letter that ended mid-sentence as if he'd been interrupted or could not bring himself to finish. 1 day after that, he died. If someone was surveilling Stanley Kubrick, they would have known when he finished the film. They would have watched him screen it for executives. They would have understood from his behaviour and communications during those final days that he recognised his danger, but felt unable to prevent what was coming. And they would have known precisely when to act. Chapter 12. The Final Journal Entry. Stanley Kubrick kept journals throughout his career. Not daily diaries, but notebooks where he recorded thoughts about projects, observations about filmmaking, reflections on the industry and his work. These journals were considered lost after his death, presumed destroyed or sealed away with materials his estate chose not to preserve. I found fragments of one in my boxes. The notebook was water-damaged, many pages illegible, edges blackened as if exposed to fire then rescued. But portions remained readable, including entries from the final weeks of his life. Most entries were mundane, technical notes about colour correction in specific scenes, reminders about sound mixing details, lists of people to contact about various post-production tasks, the normal detritus of a perfectionist completing his final film. But mixed among these practical notes were observations that revealed Kubrick's mental state during those final weeks. One entry, dated mid-February 1999, 2 weeks before the executive screening. Finished the final assembly today. Watched it through 3 times without stopping. It is exactly what I intended. Every frame precisely as planned. Every symbol placed with intention. Every detail matching the evidence I compiled over years of research. It is the most honest film I have ever made, which means it is also the most dangerous. Another entry, dated February 24th, 5 days before the screening. Received a call today from someone I do not know. They did not identify themselves or explain how they got my private number. They simply asked when I planned to deliver the final cut to the studio. I told them it was none of their business. They said they were making it their business. Then they hung up. Christiane asked who it was. I I said wrong number. But it was not a wrong number. It was a message. They wanted me to know they know. The entries became shorter, more fragmented as the screening date approached. February 28th, the day before the screening. Tomorrow they will see what I've created. Tomorrow they will understand I know what they do when they think nobody's watching. Tomorrow the protection of fiction will be tested. I have spent my career believing that art provides immunity, that showing truth through drama creates enough distance to avoid consequences. I am about to discover if that belief is correct. Then the entry from March 1st, the day of the screening itself. This entry was different. The handwriting was less controlled than usual, as if written quickly or under stress. The entry read, "Showed them the final cut today. Their faces told me everything. I have spent my career showing uncomfortable truths through the safety of fiction. 2001 showed how technology might surpass humanity. Clockwork showed how society creates monsters. Strangelove showed how pride could end civilization. Each time the message was clear enough to disturb but obscure enough to survive. This time I may have been too clear. The ritual sequence shows too much too accurately. Even dressed in drama, even performed by actors, the truth of what these gatherings represent is too visible. I wanted audiences to feel the weight of hidden power structures. I wanted them to recognize that elite cohesion operates through mechanisms the public never sees. I wanted them to understand that ceremony and ritual are not archaic remnants, but living tools used by modern power to maintain itself. I succeeded. The film shows exactly what I intended. Every symbol authentic, every detail verifiable, every element matching the evidence I compiled. Anyone who has attended these gatherings will recognize what they are seeing. Anyone with knowledge of how elite networks maintain themselves will understand what I am depicting. But success means exposure, and exposure means risk. They sat in silence after the screening, not the silence of people moved by art, the silence of people calculating consequences. I saw it in their faces, the recognition, the understanding that I have documented what should remain undocumented, the realization that even fiction can be evidence if it is accurate enough. One of them asked where my research materials were kept. I said they were secured in multiple locations with instructions for release if anything happened to me. He smiled when I said that. Not a friendly smile. The smile of someone who understands insurance only works if you can convince people you will use it. Can I use it? Can I actually release research materials that would expose not just the film's subjects, but everyone who helped me research them? Every contact who provided information, every source who shared documents, every person who spoke to me in confidence believing I would protect their privacy. I am too old to start over. The film is finished. What happens next is no longer in my control. I showed what needed to be shown. If there are consequences, so be it. Some truths matter more than safety. But I'm afraid, not of death itself, of what my death might mean for others, of how the exposure I created might ripple outward to harm people who only tried to help me, of whether my belief in the protective power of fiction was naive arrogance. Too late now. The film exists. They have seen it. Whatever comes next is already in motion. The entry ended there. No signature, no date notation. Though the journal page suggested it was written the evening of the screening. Just those words, written, by a man who would be dead 6 days later. I read that entry dozens of times, studied the handwriting, analysed the word choices, tried to understand what Kubrick was feeling as he wrote it. Fear is clear. Recognition of danger is explicit, but also resignation. Acceptance that the path forward offered no safe options, that he had committed himself to a course of action that could not be reversed. The next few journal pages were torn out, roughly, leaving jagged edges in the binding, removed by someone who wanted to ensure certain thoughts remained private. But one final entry remained, dated March 6th, 24 hours before his death. The handwriting was shaky, almost illegible in places. The entry contained only 3 lines. Insurance is a bluff if you cannot follow through. They know this. I know they know. Below that, in handwriting so faint I almost missed it, one more line. Forgive me. Stanley Kubrick died the next morning. Chapter 13. Following the funding films. Cost money. Enormous amounts of money. Eyes Wide Shut had a production budget of $65 million, significant even by Hollywood standards. Someone must provide that money, and they do not do so out of charity. They expect returns, influence, control. Warner Brothers financed the majority of production through their standard studio mechanisms. But additional funding came from private investors, individuals and organizations whose names appeared in production records only as coded entities, shell corporations, holding companies, family trusts registered in jurisdictions that prioritize privacy. I traced these entities through public records, corporate filings, investment disclosures. The trail led through layers of legal protection designed to obscure beneficial ownership. Limited liability companies registered in Delaware, trusts administrated through Swiss banks, holding companies domiciled in Liechtenstein. This structure alone proves nothing. Wealthy people use complex arrangements to manage privacy and tax obligations. Their presence in a film's financial structure does not indicate conspiracy, but the pattern was suggestive. Several private investors had documented connections to organizations that valued secrecy. Not secret societies in the conspiracy theory sense, just exclusive groups, clubs that required invitation, networks that operated through personal connection rather than public membership. One holding company that provided $7 million in secondary financing was traced to a family with extensive European holdings, banking, real estate, art collections. The family name appeared in Kubrick's research materials multiple times, always connected to exclusive gatherings at their various estates. Another investor entity was linked through board memberships to both a major financial institution and a private organisation that maintained a ceremonial complex in the Austrian Alps. Members of this organisation included politicians, business leaders, and aristocratic families across multiple European countries. A third funding source was connected to individuals who appeared in society page photographs from exclusive events over multiple decades. The same faces at different gatherings, different countries, different contexts, but always in the background, never identified in captions, just visible enough to document their presence. I found one particularly interesting connection. A holding company registered in Luxembourg provided initial seed funding for Eyes Wide Shut development years before production began. This company was ultimately controlled by a family that owned an estate where masked balls had been held annually for over 2 centuries. These were not secret events. They were documented in society pages, photographed for high-end magazines, discussed openly if discreetly in circles that paid attention to such things. But the symbolism was identical to what appeared in Kubrick's film. The specific style of masks, the architectural setting, the type of costumes worn, the ceremonial choreography. Kubrick had not invented his ritual sequence. He had recreated something that existed. And some of the people who participated in those real gatherings had, through complex financial networks, helped fund the film that depicted them. This raised uncomfortable questions. Did they know what Kubrick was planning? Did they understand he was using their money to expose their traditions? Or did they discover the truth only when they saw the final cut? If they knew from the beginning, why fund a film that threatened their privacy? Perhaps they believed their involvement gave them control, that funding the project allowed them to influence its direction, ensure it remained safely within the bounds of fiction. If they did not know initially, when did they discover what Kubrick was actually creating? At what point did concern turn to alarm, turn to decision that something needed to be done? I found a document in my boxes that suggested answers. A memorandum dated October 1998, 4 months before Kubrick's death. The header indicated it came from a legal firm in Geneva. The content was partially redacted, but visible portions read, "Regarding your inquiry about contractual obligations related to the film project, upon review of agreements signed in 1994, we find specific language requiring consultation with private investors before final cut approval. Clause 17, subsection 3 states that investors retain right to review completed film and request modifications to protect depicted individuals and organisations from potential legal liability or reputational harm. Stanley Kubrick's agreement grants him final cut approval subject to these consultation requirements. Should he refuse requested modifications, investors retain legal right to withhold distribution financing or pursue breach of contract claims. However, enforcement of these provisions becomes significantly more complex if the filmmaker is deceased and his estate must be engaged regarding contractual disputes. We recommend redacted. The memo continued, but most of the remaining text was obscured. This document suggested that private investors had built contractual protections into their funding agreements, protections that would allow them to demand changes to the film if it depicted them in ways they found threatening. But those protections only worked if Kubrick was alive to be sued, pressured, or forced to comply. Dead filmmakers cannot be brought to court. Their estates can be engaged in litigation, but the process is slow, public, messy. Much simpler if the film simply never reached final release as the director intended. Much easier to make modifications posthumously, claiming completion of the artist's vision while actually protecting investor interests. The memo's recommendation was redacted, but I can guess what it said. I traced ownership of the Geneva law firm. It represented multiple families and organisations connected to the exclusive gatherings Kubrick had researched. It specialised in privacy protection, reputation management, contractual structures designed to shield wealthy clients from exposure. This firm had helped structure the private investment in Eyes Wide Shut, had drafted the agreements giving investors oversight rights, had built legal mechanisms allowing them to control the final product if necessary. And 4 months before Kubrick died, they were analysing how those mechanisms would function if he was no longer alive to contest them. Chapter 14. The rabbit hole deepens. Research becomes obsession gradually. You tell yourself you're just curious, just following leads, just trying to understand. You maintain the fiction of objective investigation even as it consumes your thoughts, restructures your life, becomes the lens through which you view everything. Then one day you realise you have spent months chasing shadows, and the shadows are starting to chase back. I began noticing things. Archived interviews with Kubrick disappeared from online repositories. I had watched them weeks earlier, taken notes, bookmarked them for reference. When I returned, the links were dead. Not broken in the normal way where you get error messages, just gone, as if they had never existed. I searched for cached versions. Nothing. I checked the Wayback Machine. Pages that should have been archived showed as unavailable. I contacted the websites that had hosted the content. They claimed to have no record of the material I described, but I had notes. Detailed notes about what those interviews contained. Questions Kubrick was asked about his research process. His answers about how he approached depicting secret societies. His comments about the line between fiction and documentation. Those interviews existed. I watched them. Now they were gone. Broadcast clips from behind-the-scenes documentaries became increasingly difficult to find. I remembered seeing footage of Kubrick directing the ritual sequence, him explaining his vision to the cast, discussing the symbolism embedded in the choreography, describing what he wanted audiences to feel. That footage existed. It had been part of a documentary that aired after Eyes Wide Shut released. I watched it multiple times. Now every version of that documentary I could locate had been edited. The segments about the ritual sequence were shortened or removed entirely. Kubrick's explanations were replaced with generic commentary about cinematic technique. I found one intact version on a film preservation site. I downloaded it immediately, made multiple backups. 2 weeks later, I checked the site again. The file was gone, replaced with a notice. Content removed at rights holder request. Film archives that supposedly held production materials denied my request to access them, politely but firmly. Some cited privacy concerns related to the Kubrick estate. Others mentioned restrictions placed by private investors. One simply said materials I was asking about did not exist in their catalogue, despite catalogue listings I had seen showing otherwise. I started documenting everything. Screenshots, downloaded files, physical copies printed and stored in different locations. I kept backups on multiple hard drives and cloud services with friends who had no knowledge of what they were storing for me. I began to feel paranoid, checking whether I was being followed, varying my routines, wondering if my phone was monitored or my apartment searched when I was away. Exactly the behaviours Kubrick exhibited during his final months. The more I dug, the more resistance I encountered. Not overt threats, nothing dramatic that I could point to as evidence of conspiracy. Just closed doors, ignored emails, requests that went unanswered, the bureaucratic machinery of information control operating smoothly and invisibly. I reached out to film, scholars who had written about Kubrick. Most were helpful at first, sharing insights about his artistic vision and technical mastery. But when I asked about the circumstances surrounding his death, about the differences between his final cut and the theatrical release, about the financial backing of Eyes Wide Shut, conversations ended quickly. One scholar, someone whose work I respected deeply, initially agreed to meet with me. We exchanged several emails discussing my research. They seemed genuinely interested in what I was discovering. Then I sent them copies of some documents from my boxes, documents showing connections between private investors and the organisations Kubrick had researched. Their next email was brief. After reviewing the materials you sent, I must withdraw from this conversation. I recommend you stop asking these questions. Some subjects are better left unexplored. I wrote back asking what specifically concerned them. No response. I called their office. Their assistant said they were unavailable and would not be taking my calls in the future. I drove to their university and waited outside their department. When they saw me, they walked quickly in the opposite direction. What had been in those documents that frightened a tenured professor enough to run away from a colleague? Another researcher responded to my inquiry with a message that still makes me uncomfortable. I appreciate your interest in Kubrick's work, but I must be direct with you. There are people who do not want the questions you are asking to be answered. There are individuals with substantial resources who have worked very hard to ensure certain information remains private. I do not know what will happen if you continue this investigation, but I know that several people who asked similar questions in the past encountered significant difficulties. Professional difficulties, personal difficulties, legal difficulties. I am not trying to threaten you. I am trying to warn you. Please consider whether the answers you might find are worth the cost of finding them. I asked what had happened to the people who encountered difficulties. They did not respond. Strange things started happening. My apartment was broken into. Nothing was stolen. Nothing appeared disturbed. But I knew someone had been there. Small things were slightly wrong. Books reshelved in incorrect order. Papers on my desk repositioned. The boxes from Kubrick's estate had been moved slightly, then returned almost to their original positions. I reported it to police. They filed a report but found no evidence of forced entry. They suggested I might be mistaken about the break-in. People often misremember where they leave things, but I was not mistaken. Someone had searched my apartment carefully, professionally, looking for something specific. My email account started showing login attempts from unfamiliar IP addresses. My cloud storage showed access from locations I had never visited. My phone developed strange behaviours, battery draining rapidly, heating up during calls as if multiple processes were running in background. I consulted with a security expert. They analysed my devices and found sophisticated monitoring software, installed through vectors they could not fully explain. Government-grade stuff, they said. The kind of malware that requires significant resources to develop and deploy. Someone with serious capabilities is watching you, they told me. I can clean your devices, but they will just install it again. Your best option is to stop whatever you're doing that made you a target. I did not stop. I could not stop. Because by then I understood that Stanley Kubrick had been onto something real. That his investigation had uncovered networks of power operating through mechanisms most people never see, that his film threatened to expose those networks to public scrutiny, and that he had been silenced because of it. If I stopped now, his death meant nothing. The evidence he compiled would remain buried. The truth he tried to reveal through the protection of fiction would stay hidden. I owed it to him to finish what he started. even if finishing it cost me the same price it cost him. Chapter 15. The Reality Parallel. The film shows a ritual, masked figures in a mansion, choreographed movements, a ceremony that feels both theatrical and ancient. Viewers assume it is fiction because they are watching actors in a movie. But every element Kubrick depicted existed somewhere in reality. The architecture matched estates that still stand in Europe. I travelled to 3 of them, gaining access through various pretexts: tours, research permissions, simple trespassing when necessary. The ballrooms were identical to what appeared in the film. Same proportions, same ceiling heights, similar decorative elements. Not coincidence, not generic design. Specific architectural features that Kubrick had documented and recreated precisely. One estate in Austria had a ceremonial chamber that could have been the model for the film's ritual space. Circular room, domed ceiling, gallery level surrounding the main floor, specific acoustics that made whispers carry while amplifying chants. The owner allowed me to photograph it for architectural research. When I asked about the room's history, they became evasive, said it was used for family gatherings, nothing more. But in the estate's library, I found books describing ceremonies held in that space over 2 centuries, masked gatherings, seasonal celebrations that blended Catholic ritual with older traditions, events attended by aristocratic families from across Europe. The costumes mirrored ceremonial dress used in actual aristocratic gatherings. I found evidence of this in multiple sources: museum collections, private archives, photographs from exclusive events photographed for high-end publications. One museum in Vienna had an extensive collection of historical masquerade costumes. The curator, after some persuasion and a generous donation, allowed me access to their storage. There I found garments nearly identical to those in Kubrick's film. Same colour combinations, same style of masks, same ceremonial robes. These were worn at the Hofburg balls, the curator explained, and at private estates throughout the 19th century. The tradition continued into the 20th century, though in more limited circles. Some families maintain these customs even today. Which families? The curator smiled. That information is not public, but I can tell you the gatherings still occur, very privately, very exclusively. The choreography followed patterns documented in descriptions of exclusive events. I found accounts of ceremonies from multiple sources, including leaked documents and testimony from former participants. One account, written by a man who attended gatherings at a French estate in the 1960s, described movements almost identical to those in Kubrick's film. We entered the chamber in specific order, determined by rank within the organisation. The central figure stood beneath a symbol I cannot reproduce here. We formed circles, 3 concentric rings, and moved in coordinated patterns, while music played from sources hidden to maintain atmosphere of otherworldliness. The ceremony lasted approximately 40 minutes, culminating in an act I am still bound not to describe, though it was symbolic rather than literal. Symbolic rather than literal. Exactly how Kubrick depicted it. Even the symbols Kubrick included had historical analogues. The triangle inside a circle appeared in Masonic tradition. The spiral with 7 turns was documented in multiple ceremonial contexts. The owl imagery connected to Bohemian Grove and similar organisations. Kubrick had not invented fantasy. He had compiled evidence, synthesised it, and presented it as drama. I obtained recordings of several modern exclusive gatherings, not through illegal means, but through society, archives that documented social history. Video from a Venetian masquerade attended by European elite in 1993. Photographs from a private ceremony at a British estate in 1997. Audio recordings from a gathering at an American compound in 2001. The similarities to Kubrick's ritual sequence were undeniable. Same atmosphere, same sense of watching power perform itself for itself, same understanding that participants were engaging in something that reinforced their separation from ordinary society. I showed these materials to an anthropologist specialising in ritual studies. They watched in silence, taking notes, occasionally pausing to examine specific details. When finished, they said, "This film is not depicting imaginary ceremonies. This is reconstruction based on actual practices. Every element you're showing me has precedent in elite ritual tradition. The filmmaker either attended these gatherings himself, which seems unlikely given their exclusivity, or had access to extraordinary documentation. Could he have researched his way to this level of accuracy? Theoretically, yes, but it would require years of investigation, access to restricted materials, contacts within organisations that do not welcome outside inquiry. This represents either brilliant synthesis of public information or actual insider knowledge. Or both, I suggested. They nodded. Or both. Research supplemented by direct accounts from people who participated. That would explain the precision. Fiction was not protection. It was just sufficient deniability. Kubrick had shown the truth, but dressed it in enough layers of drama that audiences could choose not to recognise it. Could watch something real and tell themselves it was imaginary. Could witness evidence and categorise it as entertainment. The genius was giving people permission to ignore what they were seeing. By framing it as fiction, he allowed comfortable viewing of uncomfortable realities. But those depicted in his film did not have that luxury. They recognised what they were seeing. They understood he had documented their practices, exposed their ceremonies, revealed the mechanisms through which they maintained separation and cohesion, and they responded accordingly. Epilogue. The film that ended its director Stanley Kubrick never claimed to reveal secrets. He created art. He told stories. He explored themes that interested him using the language of cinema. But artists reveal truths even when they do not intend to. Perhaps especially when they do not intend to. The act of depicting something, even fictionally, can expose realities that powerful people prefer remain hidden. Kubrick spent his career pushing boundaries. He showed violence that made audiences uncomfortable, sexuality that challenged norms, social criticism that questioned institutions, political commentary that exposed contradictions. Each time, he wrapped his provocations in narratives that provided distance. 2001 was science fiction. Clockwork Orange was dystopian fantasy. Full Metal Jacket was historical drama. The stories were obviously fiction, which granted protection through artistic license. But Eyes Wide Shut may have pushed too far. Not in its content, which was relatively tame compared to his earlier provocations, in its accuracy, in how precisely it reconstructed what it claimed to invent. He died 5 days after screening his final cut. Natural causes, heart attack. Nothing suspicious in the official record. The timing, however, is everything. I have spent 3 years following this trail. 3 years examining documents, interviewing witnesses, connecting patterns across decades of history. 3 years that have transformed me from casual investigator to something closer to obsessive. I have boxes of evidence, documented connections between private investors and the organisations Kubrick researched. Testimony from people who worked with him and feared what they witnessed. Comparisons between his notes and the released film showing systematic alterations made after his death. I have traced funding to individuals connected to the very gatherings he depicted, found financial links between those who appeared symbolically in his film and those who controlled its final form. Documented how people with both motive and means were positioned to ensure Kubrick's vision was softened before reaching the public. I cannot prove he was killed. I cannot produce a confession or a document explicitly ordering his death. I cannot meet legal standards of evidence for murder, but I can show you a pattern, a director who spent years investigating elite power structures, who documented gatherings most people did not know existed, who compiled evidence of how modern aristocracies maintain themselves through ceremonial practice, who built all that research into a film disguised as fiction, a screening where powerful people watch themselves depicted with uncomfortable accuracy, a week of silence after that screening, a dead filmmaker before any consequences of that exposure could fully develop, modifications to the film made after the director's death, systematic removal of the most revealing details, digital alterations obscuring symbols those in power would recognise, a theatrical release that preserved atmosphere while stripping away evidence, missing footage sealed in vaults, materials removed from archives, witnesses who refused to speak, researchers who warn against asking questions, all the mechanisms of coordinated silence operating smoothly across decades. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe Stanley Kubrick, after years of obsessive work on his most personally important film, simply had the misfortune of dying days after completing it. Maybe his heart gave out from natural causes at the most dramatically inconvenient moment possible. Maybe those who had reason to fear his exposure did nothing. Maybe they simply accepted that he had revealed their secrets and moved on with their lives without consequence or retaliation. Maybe the alterations made to his film after death were innocent attempts by well-meaning people to complete his vision. Maybe the footage remains sealed for purely artistic reasons, having nothing to do with protecting the powerful. Maybe all the evidence I've compiled adds up to nothing more than interesting coincidences and paranoid connections. Or maybe Stanley Kubrick was killed for making a movie. Maybe he threatened the wrong people by documenting their rituals and ceremonies and mechanisms of power. Maybe he crossed a line when he showed how modern elites maintain cohesion through practices most people would find bizarre if not disturbing. Maybe someone decided that even fiction becomes dangerous when it is accurate enough to serve as evidence. That symbolic depiction can threaten privacy when the symbols are recognizable to those who use them. Maybe they warned him. Maybe the surveillance he felt during his final months was real. Maybe the phone call from an unknown person asking when he would deliver the film was a message rather than random inquiry. Maybe when he refused to back down, refused to soften his vision, refused to pretend he had not seen what he had clearly documented, they decided the simplest solution was to ensure he never made another film. A heart attack is easy to fake if you have resources and expertise. Untraceable drugs exist that cause cardiac arrest indistinguishable from natural causes. Access to someone's home, a moment of privacy and medical knowledge are all that is required. Or maybe they did nothing directly. Maybe they simply applied pressure. Financial pressure, legal pressure, social pressure. Maybe the stress of fighting people with unlimited resources caused genuine cardiac failure. Maybe they killed him without ever touching him. I do not know which is true. I only know that a master filmmaker completed his final work, screened it for people with power and connections, and died before he could share it with the world. The boxes sit in my apartment, hidden now in locations even I try not to think about too specifically. The documents remain filed and cross-referenced. The questions continue to multiply, and somewhere, in a vault protected by layers of legal restrictions and institutional secrecy, the footage Stanley Kubrick wanted you to see remains sealed. Perhaps that tells you everything you need to know. 3 years ago, I was a distant relative who inherited some boxes. Now I am someone who understands why those boxes were almost destroyed, why the materials they contained were considered too sensitive for general distribution, why people who worked with Kubrick refused to speak about their experiences. I understand why my parents exchanged that look when news of his death reached our family, why my father told me some questions are better left unasked, why people throughout my investigation warned me to stop digging, because the truth is not always liberating. Sometimes truth is dangerous. Sometimes revealing what powerful people prefer hidden comes with costs that exceed any benefit the revelation might provide. Stanley Kubrick learned that lesson. He spent his final weeks understanding that he had miscalculated, that fiction was not sufficient protection, that showing truth even through symbolic depiction could provoke responses that no amount of artistic genius could defend against. He died with that knowledge, died knowing he had created something that could not be shown as he intended, died understanding that his final film would be altered, softened, transformed into something safer before reaching the audience he had worked so hard to enlighten. And now I carry similar knowledge. I have the evidence he compiled. I have seen the connections he documented. I understand what he was trying to show and why it threatened the people he depicted. I also understand the price of that understanding. My apartment has been searched multiple times now. My devices are certainly monitored. People connected to my investigation have been contacted and warned away from speaking with me. I receive messages suggesting I should pursue other interests, find different research topics, let historical questions remain historical. I am being given the same choice Kubrick faced. Continue toward truth and accept consequences, or step back, acknowledge certain things are too dangerous to reveal, and live safely with diminished knowledge. Kubrick chose truth. 5 days later, he was dead. I am still choosing, still weighing whether what I might reveal justifies the cost I will certainly pay for revealing it. This documentary is my attempt to split the difference, to tell the story without telling everything, to suggest connections without proving them definitively, to present evidence while maintaining enough ambiguity to claim I am merely speculating. It is cowardice, dressed as caution. I recognise that. Stanley Kubrick would recognise it too. But maybe cowardice is wisdom when the alternative is dying before your work reaches the people you created it for. Sleep well, friends. Question everything. Trust nothing completely. And remember that fiction sometimes hides truth too dangerous to speak directly. Somewhere in a vault, the real version of Eyes Wide Shut waits to be seen. Somewhere in boxes, evidence waits to be revealed. Somewhere in the shadows of power, people wait to ensure neither ever reaches the light. Stanley Kubrick tried to show us what he found in those shadows. They made sure he could only show us part of it. The rest remains hidden. For now. Sleep theories. Thanks you for listening. We are a global community exploring mysteries that demand attention. Share your location and thoughts in the comments. Until next time, sleep well and question everything. Flight 370, the plane that vanished. Imagine boarding a plane for a routine overnight flight. You settle into your seat, close your eyes, and drift off as the engines hum beneath you. 6 hours later, you should wake up in Beijing. Instead, you wake up nowhere. You're simply gone, erased from the sky. No wreckage, no answers, no closure. This is not a thought experiment. This happened to 239 people on March 8th, 2014. And 10 years later, we still do not know why. The night everything changed. The air in Kuala Lumpur International Airport hung thick and humid on that March evening. Passengers filtered through the gate for Malaysian Airlines Flight 370, a red-eye service to Beijing Capital International Airport. Most were Chinese nationals heading home. Others were international travellers connecting through Beijing to destinations beyond. The Boeing 777 that would carry them sat gleaming under the airport lights. Registration number 9 Mike Romeo Oscar. Nearly £400,000 of aircraft, fuel, cargo and human life. Among the passengers was Philip Wood, an American executive working for IBM in Beijing. He had texted his partner before boarding, talking about plans for the summer, about maybe finally taking that vacation to Thailand they had been discussing. There was Wang Linshi, a 50-year-old calligraphy artist returning from an exhibition in Kuala Lumpur. His daughter was pregnant with his first grandchild. He carried a small carved wooden box in his carry-on, a gift he had spent weeks searching for. There were 23 employees of Freescale Semiconductor, engineers and technicians heading home after a week of technical training. They joked about the late departure time as they boarded, making plans to sleep through the flight. None of them knew they had approximately 1 hour and 38 minutes left to exist in the known world. At 12:41 in the morning local time, the wheels lifted off Malaysian soil. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, 53 years old with 18,000 hours of flight experience, commanded the aircraft. First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid, 27, sat beside him. Everything proceeded normally. The plane climbed into the darkness, turning northeast toward the South China Sea. The cabin lights dimmed. Passengers reclined their seats. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, offering blankets and confirming seat belts. The cockpit was quiet. Routine. The autopilot system had already taken over the majority of flying tasks. The aircraft knew where it needed to go. All the pilots had to do was monitor, supervise and wait for Beijing to appear on the horizon in 5.5 hours. Air traffic control in Kuala Lumpur handed the flight off to Vietnamese airspace. At 1:19 in the morning, a voice from the cockpit transmitted the standard acknowledgement. "Good night, Malaysian 37. 0. Routine words. Calm. Professional. Nothing to suggest what would happen next. 2 minutes later, at 1:21, the aircraft's transponder went silent. A transponder is not a luxury item. It is the voice that tells the world where you are, who you are, and how high you are flying. When it stops transmitting, the aircraft becomes a ghost. Controllers in Vietnam waited for Flight 370 to appear on their screens. It never did. They called Malaysian Air Traffic Control. "Has the flight left your airspace?" "Yes," came the reply. "It should be with you now." But it was not with anyone. For several minutes, controllers assumed it was a technical glitch. Transponders fail. Radios malfunction. It happens. They waited for the blip to reappear, for the pilots to call in with a problem report, for something normal to explain the absence. The minutes stretched. The silence deepened. And somewhere over the dark waters of the South China Sea, 239 people continued flying into oblivion. The turn. What happened next would become the foundation for every theory, every sleepless night, every conspiracy that followed. At 1:21, the moment the transponder died, the aircraft did not fall from the sky. It did not explode. It did not vanish into the ocean. Instead, it turned. A deliberate, calculated turn. Not the panicked maneuver of a pilot fighting for control, but the smooth banking arc of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The turn was precise. It occurred at the exact moment when responsibility for the aircraft was transferring between Malaysian and Vietnamese air traffic control. In that brief window, when neither controller was actively watching, the plane pivoted. It was the kind of timing that suggests either meticulous planning or extraordinary coincidence, and coincidences of that magnitude do not happen often in aviation. Military radar, which does not rely on transponders, tracked the aircraft as it reversed course. It flew back across the Malay Peninsula, threading through the border between Malaysian and Thai airspace. This corridor, the boundary between two countries, is monitored by both nations but actively controlled by neither. It is a seam in the radar coverage, a gap where an aircraft can fly without triggering immediate alerts. The plane followed this seam as though following a map. It passed directly over Malaysia at cruising altitude, over towns and cities where people slept, over the capital where government buildings sat dark and empty. No fighter jets scrambled to intercept, no alarm systems triggered. The aircraft was invisible to civilian radar and ignored by military systems that assumed it was an authorised flight. By 2:22 in the morning, it had travelled hundreds of miles in the wrong direction, heading northwest toward the Andaman Sea, and it was still flying. This was not a malfunction. This was a plan. The aircraft continued on this northwestern heading for approximately another hour. It flew over the Andaman Sea, that vast stretch of water between Thailand and India. Ships below saw nothing. Fishermen pulling nets in the darkness had no idea a commercial airliner was passing overhead. The plane was alone, cut off from communication, invisible to tracking systems, moving with purpose toward a destination no one could identify. Then, somewhere over the ocean, it turned again. This time, south. A long, sweeping arc that would take it away from all commercial flight paths, away from land, away from any place where people might notice. The Indian Ocean stretched before it, millions of square kilometres of empty water, and the aircraft pointed itself toward the void. At 8:11 that morning, nearly 7 hours after takeoff, a satellite owned by the British telecommunications company in Muscat registered a final automatic handshake with the aircraft. The plane's communication system, even with the transponder disabled, continued sending hourly pings to the satellite network. These pings did not contain location data, but engineers could analyse the signal to estimate distance and direction. The mathematics pointed to one conclusion. The aircraft had flown south, deep into the Indian Ocean, far beyond any possible landing site. Then silence, absolute and final. The search for ghosts. When dawn broke over the South China Sea on March 8th, families waiting at Beijing Airport knew something had gone wrong. Flight 370 had not arrived. It had not diverted. It had simply failed to exist. The arrival board showed the flight as delayed, then cancelled, then removed entirely. Airline representatives appeared, their faces carefully neutral, and began escorting family members to private rooms. They offered water, tissues, and apologies for the lack of information. They could not say where the plane was because they did not know. Vietnamese search and rescue teams scrambled aircraft and ships to scour the waters between Malaysia and Vietnam. They found nothing. No debris, no oil slick, no emergency beacons. The ocean surface remained pristine, as though the plane had never been there. They expanded the search area, thinking perhaps the aircraft had deviated slightly from its flight plan. They checked islands, coastlines, shallow waters where wreckage might be visible from the air. Nothing. For days, the search focused on the wrong ocean. Authorities assumed the aircraft had gone down somewhere near its intended flight path. It was a reasonable assumption. Planes do not turn around and fly backward. They do not disable their communication systems and navigate using military radar gaps. Ships crisscrossed the South China Sea. Aircraft flew grid patterns until their fuel tanks ran dry. International teams from China, Australia, Malaysia, and the United States poured resources into the effort. They were searching for a needle in a haystack, except the haystack was the size of a small country and the needle was made of aluminum that sinks. The media descended. Reporters from every major news organisation converged on Kuala Lumpur and Beijing. They interviewed aviation experts, radar specialists and former pilots. Everyone had theories. Some suggested mechanical failure. Others pointed to terrorism. A few mentioned hijacking. But without wreckage, without bodies, without any physical evidence, every explanation was speculation dressed up as analysis. On March 24th, Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak held a press conference. His face carried the weight of impossible news. Based on satellite analysis, he announced, Flight 370 had ended its journey in the southern Indian Ocean west of Perth, Australia. There were no survivors. The plane had flown for hours in the opposite direction of its destination before running out of fuel and plunging into one of the most remote stretches of water on Earth. The families in Beijing erupted. Some collapsed. Others screamed. A few attacked the airline representatives, demanding proof, demanding explanations, demanding that someone tell them how a plane could simply disappear in the age of satellites and GPS and global connectivity. The Malaysian government offered condolences. They promised a full investigation. They assured everyone that the truth would be found. But the truth was already drowning in miles of seawater, and no one knew where to look. The search shifted. Australian authorities coordinated the largest maritime search operation in history. Ships equipped with sophisticated sonar systems dragged towfish across the ocean floor, scanning an area that eventually exceeded 120,000 square kilometres. The technology was impressive. Side-scan sonar that could image the ocean bottom in stunning detail. Autonomous underwater vehicles that could dive deeper than any human and stay down for days. Magnetometers that detected metal from miles away. They mapped underwater mountains, discovered new marine species, and found shipwrecks that had been lost for centuries. But they did not find Flight 370. The search vessels operated in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. The Indian Ocean is not gentle. Waves reached heights that dwarfed the ships. Storms rolled through with violence that shut down operations for days at a time. Crew members lived in cramped quarters. staring at sonar screens for hours, watching the ocean floor scroll past in grainy monochrome. Every anomaly triggered excitement. Every rock formation that looked slightly out of place became a potential lead. They would mark the coordinates, send down an underwater vehicle to investigate, and find nothing but geology and marine life. The operation cost more than $160 million. It involved multiple nations, dozens of ships, and thousands of personnel. It continued for nearly 3 years. In January of 2017, the search was officially suspended. The families of the missing were left with condolences and questions. The ocean had swallowed an entire aircraft, and it was not giving it back. Fragments of proof. Then the ocean began to speak, one piece at a time. In July of 2015, Johnny Baig, a municipal worker on Reunion Island, was cleaning a beach on the eastern shore. It was routine work. Trash washed ashore constantly. Plastic bottles, fishing nets, debris from ships passing through the Indian Ocean shipping lanes. But this piece was different. It was large, maybe 6 feet long, covered in barnacles and algae. The metal underneath showed through in places, along with what looked like identifying numbers. Begay called the authorities. Within hours, aviation experts arrived. They photographed the object from every angle. They documented the barnacle growth, the corrosion patterns, the way the metal had torn. Then they loaded it onto a plane and flew it to France, where specialists at a facility outside Toulouse would examine it in a climate-controlled laboratory. It was a flaperon, part of the wing structure used to control the aircraft during landing. The serial numbers matched. It came from 9 Mike Romeo Oscar. It came from Flight 370. The discovery changed everything. It proved the aircraft had not been hidden on some remote island or secret military base. It had crashed. It had broken apart. And the currents of the Indian Ocean had been slowly distributing the wreckage for over a year. But the flaperon also raised questions. It showed evidence of high-speed impact, but not catastrophic destruction. The way it had separated from the wing suggested the aircraft had hit the water hard, but perhaps not as violently as a straight nosedive would produce. Some experts argued this indicated a controlled ditching attempt. Others said it proved nothing beyond the fact that the plane had crashed. Over the following months, more fragments appeared. A piece of wing washed ashore in Mozambique in February of 2016. Interior panelling from the cabin turned up on Madagascar a month later. A section of engine cowling arrived on the coast of Tanzania. Each fragment carried the signature marks of the missing Boeing 777. The Indian Ocean had been slowly digesting the wreckage for years, and now it was offering proof that the aircraft had indeed met its end in those waters. Beachcombers became amateur investigators. People walking coastlines across the western Indian Ocean began looking for debris. They found fragments of composite material, pieces of what might have been seat components, scraps of metal that could have come from anywhere. The Malaysian government established protocols for reporting finds. Each piece was documented, photographed and analysed. Some were confirmed as coming from Flight 370. Others were from different aircraft, different accidents, different tragedies that the ocean had also claimed, but the fragments raised as many questions as they answered. Why only small pieces? Where was the main wreckage? Where were the flight data recorders, the black boxes that could explain everything? The pieces that had washed ashore represented less than 1% of the aircraft's total mass. A 777 weighs over 300,000 pounds empty. What had been recovered could fit in a cargo van. The rest remained hidden somewhere beneath miles of water. Ocean current experts studied the drift patterns. They built computer models simulating how debris would move through the Indian Ocean. They factored in wind, surface currents, deep ocean circulation patterns, and the Coriolis effect. The model suggested that if debris had appeared on Reunion Island in July of 2015, the crash site must be farther north and east than the official search area. The plane might have come down closer to Madagascar, not off the coast of Australia. If true, the entire 3-year search had been conducted in the wrong ocean. The ships had dragged their sonar arrays over the wrong sea floor, the underwater vehicles had photographed the wrong underwater mountains, and Flight 370 remained exactly where it had always been, untouched and undiscovered. The official conclusion: in July of 2018, the Malaysian government released its final report on the disappearance. The document ran to hundreds of pages. It contained radar data, satellite analysis, maintenance records, and biographical profiles of the crew. It examined the cargo manifest, passenger lists, and airport security footage. It included testimony from air traffic controllers, statements from family members, and technical assessments from aviation engineers. The conclusions were careful, measured, and ultimately unsatisfying. The aircraft had been manually diverted from its flight path by a person or persons unknown in the cockpit. The communication systems had been deliberately disabled. The transponder did not fail. Someone turned it off. The OCAR system, which transmits engine performance data, was also disabled. Someone went through the cockpit overhead panel and systematically shut down every system that would allow the outside world to track the aircraft. This required knowledge, access, and time. It was not the action of hijackers forcing their way into the cockpit. It was the methodical work of someone who belonged there. The plane had flown on for hours under human control before fuel exhaustion caused it to descend into the ocean. The final satellite handshake suggested the aircraft was in a rapid descent, possibly unpowered. Whether this descent was controlled or resulted from the aircraft simply falling out of the sky after running out of fuel could not be determined. Then came the admission that stripped away any sense of closure. The team is unable to determine the real cause for the disappearance, the report stated. We cannot exclude the possibility that there was unlawful interference by a third party. In other words, after 4 years, hundreds of millions of dollars, and the largest search in aviation history, the official answer was this: we do not know. Someone did something, and we cannot tell you who or why. It was an invitation for speculation, an open door through which every conspiracy theory, every alternative explanation, and every buried suspicion could walk. The captain and the flight simulator. Zahari Ahmad Shah had been flying for Malaysian Airlines since 1981. He was not a rookie. He was not erratic. Colleagues described him as professional, calm, and deeply knowledgeable. He had logged 18,000 flight hours, the kind of experience that turns piloting into muscle memory. He was a father, a husband, and an aviation enthusiast who built a full flight simulator in his home. The simulator was not a toy. It was a sophisticated setup using commercial software and professional-grade controls. He used it to practice approaches to difficult airports, to explore scenery, and to refine his skills. After the disappearance, Malaysian investigators seized the simulator. Forensic analysts recovered deleted files from the hard drive. What they found sent a chill through the investigation. Among the saved flight plans was a route that flew south into the Indian Ocean, continuing until fuel exhaustion. The flight path matched almost exactly the satellite data showing where the real aircraft had gone. The simulator data showed coordinates that aligned with the presumed crash site. The flight profile showed an aircraft flying for hours, far beyond any normal route, until the fuel gauges read 0. It was as though someone had been planning, testing, rehearsing for the exact scenario that unfolded on March 8th. Had Zahari rehearsed his own suicide mission? The evidence seemed damning. He had the skill to disable every communication system on the aircraft. He had the knowledge to exploit radar gaps and international airspace boundaries. He knew the exact moment to turn off the transponder, the precise corridor to fly through to avoid detection, and the fuel calculations needed to reach the most remote part of the Indian Ocean. If anyone could make a 777 vanish, it was him. Investigators dug deeper into his personal life. They interviewed friends, family members, and colleagues. They examined his financial records, his political affiliations, and his social media activity. They found a man who seemed, by all accounts, content. His marriage had its problems, but what marriage does not after decades? His finances were stable. He was respected at work and liked by those who knew him. He had no terminal illness, no crushing debt, no scandal that would drive someone to desperate action. Some pointed to his support for Malaysian opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim, who had been convicted of sodomy charges just hours before the flight departed. Zahari had attended political rallies. He had posted on social media about government corruption and judicial overreach. Could he have been so enraged by the verdict that he decided to make a political statement written in jet fuel and ocean water? The theory felt strained. Even if he opposed the government, why kill hundreds of innocent people? Why leave no message explaining his actions? Political protesters want attention. They want their grievances heard. A protest without a statement is not a protest. It is simply murder. And mass murder without explanation is the action of someone who has abandoned all connection to the human community. But there was another interpretation of the simulator data. Pilots run unusual scenarios all the time. They practice emergency procedures. They explore what-if situations. What if all engines failed over the ocean? What if communication systems went dead? What if you had to ditch in water? Running these scenarios in a simulator is precisely what a conscientious, skilled pilot would do. It is preparation, not planning. And the fact that one scenario happened to match the actual flight path could be coincidence. Or it could be proof. The investigation could not decide. They presented the evidence and left the conclusion ambiguous. Zahari remained Schrödinger's pilot, simultaneously innocent and guilty until someone opened the black box that would collapse the uncertainty into fact. But the black box was somewhere on the ocean floor and no one could find it. The ghost in the machine. The Boeing 777 is not just an aircraft. It is a flying computer network. Every system, from navigation to engine performance, feeds data through digital channels. The plane talks to the ground, to satellites, to its own internal components. It is monitored, measured, and managed by software. Hundreds of computers coordinate to keep the aircraft in the air. And where there are computers, there are vulnerabilities. In the years following 9/11, engineers developed concepts for remote flight recovery systems. The idea was simple and compelling. If hijackers took control of an aircraft, a signal from the ground could override the cockpit and fly the plane to safety. Passengers and crew would be protected. Hijackers would be neutralized. Terrorism in the sky would become impossible. Boeing filed patents for such technology. The concepts included encrypted communication links that could take control of flight systems, override manual inputs from the cockpit, and land the aircraft at a predetermined safe location. Honeywell explored similar systems. The goal was noble, but the implications were terrifying. If you can override a hijacker, you can override anyone. If you can remotely control a plane for good, you can remotely control it for anything. Conspiracy theorists latched onto this. What if Flight 370 was not diverted by the pilots, but by someone else? What if a cyber intrusion, a military override, or a classified program took control of the aircraft and flew it to a location the public was never meant to discover? The sudden loss of the transponder, the deliberate course change, the hours of silent flight through radar gaps all fit the profile of external interference. Think about the sequence of events. At 1:21 in the morning, multiple systems went dark simultaneously. The transponder stopped transmitting. The Akars data link cut off. The radio went silent. For all of these systems to fail at once would require either catastrophic damage to the aircraft or deliberate action by someone with intimate knowledge of the plane's architecture. But there was no evidence of catastrophic damage. The plane kept flying. If someone in the cockpit was responsible, they would have needed to know exactly which circuit breakers to pull, which switches to flip, and which systems to disable in what order. They would have needed to do this while maintaining control of the aircraft, avoiding detection, and navigating through some of the most monitored airspace in the world. It is possible. Pilots train for emergencies that require quickly disabling systems, but the precision and timing suggest something more than emergency response. It suggests planning. But what if the actions came from outside the cockpit? What if someone accessed the aircraft's systems remotely and took control? The Boeing 777 does have data links that allow ground personnel to communicate with the aircraft's computers. These links are used for routine maintenance monitoring and software updates. They are encrypted and secured, but encryption can be broken, and security can be bypassed. In the years since Flight 370 disappeared, security researchers have demonstrated vulnerabilities in aviation systems. They have shown how spoofing GPS signals can confuse navigation systems. They have hacked into in-flight entertainment networks and accessed deeper aircraft systems. They have proven that the digital architecture of modern aircraft, while sophisticated, is not impenetrable. The region through which Flight 370 flew is not empty airspace. It includes military zones monitored by multiple nations. Thailand operates radar installations that track everything moving through their airspace. India has air defence networks covering the Andaman Sea. The United States maintains signals intelligence facilities throughout the region. If the aircraft was hijacked remotely, those governments would have known. Their systems would have detected unusual communications, anomalous radar tracks or electronic signatures indicating a cyber operation. And if they knew, their silence becomes part of the cover-up. It transforms the disappearance from a tragedy into an act of war or espionage, or some classified operation that cannot be acknowledged without exposing capabilities the public is not meant to know exist. But there is a problem. No evidence exists that remote override technology was ever installed on 9 Mike Romeo Oscar. The systems were theoretical, not operational. Boeing and Malaysian Airlines both confirmed that the aircraft lacked any such capability. Hacking into a plane mid-flight would require exploiting vulnerabilities that had never been demonstrated in a real-world scenario outside of controlled research environments. It is possible in the way that many things are technically possible, but that does not make it probable. Still, the theory persists because it answers the unanswerable. If human error or pilot suicide seems too simple, and if mechanical failure does not fit the facts, then external interference becomes the explanation that fills the void. It transforms a tragedy into a crime, and crimes have perpetrators. Crimes can be solved. Someone can be held accountable. The alternative, that chaos simply reached up and snatched 239 people out of existence, offers no one to blame and no path to justice. The island, no one admits exists. There is a place in the Indian Ocean that does not appear on most commercial maps. Diego Garcia, a coral atoll in the Chagos archipelago, leased by the British to the United States military. It hosts one of the most secretive and strategically important military installations on the planet. Long-range bombers operate from its runways. Nuclear submarines resupply at its docks. Intelligence operations launch from its secure facilities. Detainees captured in the War on Terror have been held there, far from lawyers and oversight, and it lies within fuel range of the last known position of Flight 370. The atoll is small, barely visible on most maps, but its strategic value is enormous. Diego Garcia sits at the crossroads of the Indian Ocean, positioned perfectly to project military power across Africa, the Middle East and South Asia. The base is so sensitive that even acknowledging operations there requires security clearances most military personnel will never obtain. What happens on Diego Garcia stays on Diego Garcia. Online researchers began connecting dots almost immediately after the disappearance. What if the aircraft did not crash? What if it was intercepted after entering restricted airspace and forced to land at Diego Garcia? The theory gained traction for several reasons. First, a controlled landing would explain the lack of debris in the initial search area. If the plane landed intact, there would be no wreckage floating in the South China Sea. The weeks of fruitless searching would make perfect sense. They were looking for something that had never crashed. Second, the US military had the capability to track and intercept an aircraft operating in that region. Diego Garcia has radar coverage extending for hundreds of miles. They would have seen Flight 370 coming. They would have known it was off course, unresponsive to radio calls, and heading toward restricted airspace. Standard protocols would require an intercept. Fighter jets would have been scrambled, the aircraft would have been visually identified, and if it entered the exclusion zone around Diego Garcia without authorization, the military would have options ranging from forced landing to shooting it down. Third, the base's extreme secrecy meant that any operation conducted there would remain hidden from public view. If the aircraft landed on Diego Garcia, the passengers could be detained indefinitely. The plane could be hidden in a hangar or dismantled, evidence could be controlled, and the official story could be whatever the governments involved decided it should be. Supporters of the theory pointed to anomalies. Some claim that satellite imagery from the night of the disappearance showed unusual activity at Diego Garcia. Commercial satellites do not typically photograph military bases, but some amateur satellite trackers reported that imaging satellites passed over the atoll around the time Flight 370 would have been in the area. The images were not released publicly, which conspiracy theorists took as confirmation that something was being hidden. Others noted that several passengers aboard the flight had connections to technology or defence industries. The Freescale semiconductor employees, for instance, worked on cutting-edge chip designs used in military applications. What if one of them was carrying sensitive information? What if the entire aircraft was intercepted to prevent that information from reaching China? It would be an extreme measure, but for information valuable enough, extreme measures might be justified. The theory gained further traction when a passenger aboard the flight, Philip Wood, allegedly sent a text message and photo after the plane disappeared. The metadata from the photo, according to claims circulating online, showed GPS coordinates placing it at Diego Garcia. The image itself was black, as though taken from inside a dark room or while the phone was concealed. The accompanying message claimed he had been drugged, was being held captive, and did not know where he was. Tech experts quickly debunked the claim. The metadata was fabricated. The message was a hoax. But the story spread faster than the debunking, and for many it became evidence of a cover-up, but the theory requires a conspiracy so vast it strains credibility. It would mean the United States, Malaysia, Australia, China, and multiple other governments coordinated a cover-up involving thousands of personnel. Air traffic controllers, radar operators, satellite analysts, search and rescue teams, investigators, and journalists would all need to be complicit or deceived. It would mean families grieving for their loved ones were lied to for years. It would mean wreckage was planted on beaches across the Indian Ocean to support a false narrative. And for what? To hide the capture of one aircraft? To conceal the detention of 239 people who would never be allowed to contact the outside world again? To protect information that could have been seized on the ground before the plane ever took off? The operational complexity and political risk of such a scheme far outweigh any conceivable benefit. The United States denied any involvement. The Malaysian government found no evidence supporting the theory. No whistleblowers emerged. No satellite photos confirmed the claims. Diego Garcia's logs, according to official statements, showed no record of Flight 370 ever approaching the base. And yet the theory endures because Diego Garcia represents the ultimate black box, a place where secrets go to hide, a location where the impossible becomes plausible simply because no one can prove otherwise. The cargo that should not have been there. Every flight carries baggage, freight and cargo that passengers never see. Flight 370 was no exception. The manifest listed 221 kilograms of lithium-ion batteries and 2.5 tons of electronics equipment shipped by Motorola. On the surface, this seems routine. Airlines transport batteries and electronics constantly. But the details raised questions. Lithium batteries are dangerous. They store energy in a volatile chemical form that can ignite under the right conditions. Overheating, physical damage, or manufacturing defects can trigger thermal runaway, a chain reaction where the battery heats itself to combustion. Once a lithium fire starts, it is nearly impossible to extinguish. Water does not work. Conventional fire extinguishers are ineffective. The fire burns until the chemical fuel is exhausted, releasing toxic gases and intense heat. Aviation regulators impose strict limits on how lithium batteries are packaged and transported. They must be individually protected, stored in fireproof containers, and limited in quantity per shipment. If the batteries on Flight 370 were improperly packed, they could have started a fire in the cargo hold. A fire could explain the sudden communication failures. Smoke and heat would incapacitate the crew. The aircraft on autopilot would continue flying until the fire consumed critical systems or the fuel ran out. Several fatal crashes have been caused by cargo fires. In 2010, UPS Airlines Flight 6 crashed in Dubai after a fire in the cargo hold filled the cockpit with smoke. The crew declared an emergency, but by the time they attempted to land, both pilots were incapacitated. The aircraft crashed short of the runway. Investigation revealed that lithium batteries in the cargo had ignited. Could the same thing have happened to Flight 370? The timeline seems to fit. The transponder went dark at 1:21. A fire could have been burning for several minutes before that, filling the cargo hold with smoke. The crew might have noticed warnings, declared an emergency to air traffic control, and then been cut off as the fire destroyed communication systems. The turn back toward Malaysia would make sense. They were trying to return to Kuala Lumpur for an emergency landing, but this theory has a fatal flaw. The satellite data proves the aircraft flew for nearly 7 hours after the transponder went dark. A cargo fire severe enough to disable communications would have destroyed the plane within minutes, not hours. The fire would have burned through control cables, hydraulic lines, and structural components. The aircraft would have become uncontrollable and crashed in the South China Sea, not the Indian Ocean. And the deliberate course change, the precise navigation through radar gaps, suggests human intent, not a crew desperately fighting a fire. Other researchers focused on the nature of the cargo itself. What was Motorola shipping? The manifest listed the items as electronics, but provided no specifics. Customs documents showed weights that did not quite match the manifest. Some components were listed as radio equipment. Others were described as accessories. The vagueness invited speculation. Some theorized that the cargo included sensitive technology or intelligence materials being transported to China. Semiconductor components, encrypted communications devices, prototypes of military hardware. If true, could a foreign power have intercepted the aircraft to seize the cargo? Could the plane have been shot down to prevent the technology from reaching its destination? These theories collapse under scrutiny. Shooting down a civilian airliner to stop a shipment of electronics is not how intelligence agencies operate. It is too public, too messy, and too risky. If a government wanted to intercept cargo, they would do it on the ground, at the airport, before the plane ever took off. Customs inspections, security screenings, and freight audits provide ample opportunity to examine cargo without resorting to aircraft interception. And even if someone did shoot down Flight 370, the debris would have been found. A missile strike leaves evidence. Wreckage does not fly 7 hours south and then gently scatter itself across the Indian Ocean. Missile fragments would be embedded in the debris. Chemical residues from the warhead would be detectable. Radar systems across multiple countries would have tracked the missile launch and impact. The cargo conspiracy persists because the manifest documents remain incomplete. Conflicting reports about weights and contents fuel suspicion. When governments cannot provide clear answers about what was on the plane, people assume they're hiding something, and perhaps they are. But the secret is more likely bureaucratic incompetence than international intrigue. Shipping manifests are often incomplete, especially for complex electronics. Customs forms are filled out by freight handlers who may not understand the technical specifications of what they are loading. Errors happen, discrepancies appear, and in the absence of malice, never attribute to conspiracy what can be explained by ordinary human carelessness. The shadow plane. 4 months after Flight 370 disappeared, another Malaysian Airlines Boeing 777 met a violent end. On July 17, 2014, Flight 17 was shot down over eastern Ukraine by a surface-to-air missile fired from territory controlled by Russian-backed separatists. 298 people died. The aircraft disintegrated at cruising altitude, scattering wreckage across fields and villages in the war zone. Bodies fell from the sky. Debris rained down over an area covering several square kilometres. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Same airline, same aircraft type, similar flight numbers, both disasters occurring within months of each other. For conspiracy theorists, the coincidence was too perfect. They proposed something breathtaking in its audacity. What if Flight 370 never crashed? What if it was secretly moved, repainted with the registration number of Flight 17, and deliberately destroyed over Ukraine to escalate geopolitical tensions with Russia? The theory goes like this. Flight 370 was taken, either by interception or by pilot action, and flown to a secret location. The passengers were disposed of, the exact method left to imagination. The aircraft was stored in a hangar, repainted, and fitted with the registration number and markings of Flight 17. On July 17th, this substitute aircraft, already filled with corpses to match the passenger manifest, was flown into Ukrainian airspace along the route that Flight 17 should have taken. It was shot down by the missile, providing the West with evidence to blame Russia for killing civilians and justifying sanctions and military escalation. The motive, they argued, was to frame Russia for downing a civilian airliner, strengthening Western support for sanctions and military aid to Ukraine. The conflict had been simmering for months. Pro-Russian separatists controlled parts of eastern Ukraine. The West supported the Ukrainian government. A civilian massacre would shift public opinion, justify intervention, and provide a casus belli for deeper involvement. The theory captivated corners of the internet because it explained two mysteries with one conspiracy. It accounted for the lack of wreckage from Flight 370 and provided a false flag explanation for the downing of Flight 17. It transformed random tragedies into calculated acts of statecraft. It gave meaning to the senseless and imposed narrative order on chaos. But the theory collapses the moment you examine the evidence. Investigators recovered wreckage from Flight 17. They documented serial numbers on engines, structural components, and cockpit fragments. They traced manufacturer plates back to Boeing production records. Every piece confirmed the aircraft was indeed the plane that departed Amsterdam on July 17th, carrying 298 passengers and crew, not a substitute flown in from a hangar somewhere. The wreckage analysis was exhaustive. Independent investigators from the Netherlands, Australia, Belgium, Malaysia and Ukraine participated. They recovered the cockpit, pieced together the fuselage sections, and examined the damage patterns. The aircraft showed evidence of high-energy fragmentation, consistent with proximity detonation of a surface-to-air missile warhead. Shrapnel had penetrated the airframe from outside. The damage was not staged, it was real. Moreover, the two aircraft had different maintenance histories, different configurations, and different equipment installed. Flight 370 was an older aircraft delivered in 2002. Flight 17 was newer, delivered in 1997. They had different interior layouts, different in-flight entertainment systems, different wear patterns from years of service. Swapping them would require replacing every component that carried identifying information. It would mean fooling airline staff who had worked on both planes, airport personnel who had serviced them, investigators from multiple nations who examined the wreckage, and the families of passengers who boarded Flight 17 in Amsterdam and could identify their loved ones from the remains recovered. The logistics alone make the theory impossible. You cannot secretly move a 777 without dozens of people noticing. Aircraft require maintenance crews, fuel trucks, tow vehicles, and flight plans. They leave paper trails, hangar records, surveillance footage, radio communications. Every step of moving an aircraft from one location to another generates documentation, and every person involved in such an operation becomes a potential whistleblower. And yet the theory persists because the human mind seeks patterns, even in chaos. 2 Malaysian Airlines 777's meeting disaster within 4 months feels like it cannot be coincidence. The timing seems too perfect, the similarities too pronounced. But coincidences happen. Probability does not care about narrative symmetry. Sometimes the universe is just cruel. Sometimes tragedies cluster for no reason other than random chance and the sheer number of flights operating every day. The mathematics of silence in Marsat, the British satellite company, became an unlikely protagonist in the search for Flight 370. Their satellites provided the only real-time data showing where the aircraft had gone after disappearing from radar. The system was never designed for tracking planes. It was meant to handle routine communications between aircraft and ground stations, email services, internet connectivity, phone calls from passengers willing to pay premium rates. But engineers realised they could extract information from the signal itself. Every hour, the aircraft's communication system sent an automatic handshake to the satellite, a digital ping confirming the connection was active. Think of it as a heartbeat, the system checking in to say I'm still here. These pings did not contain GPS data. They did not include altitude, heading, or speed. They were simply electronic acknowledgements that the link between aircraft and satellite remained intact. But buried in these pings was information. 2 crucial pieces of data that, combined, could reveal where the aircraft had been. First, the time it took for the signal to travel from the plane to the satellite revealed distance. Radio waves travel at the speed of the light, a constant. Measure the round-trip time of the signal, and you can calculate how far the aircraft was from the satellite. This gave engineers a circle. Somewhere on this circle, at this specific distance from the satellite, was Flight 370. Second, the frequency shift caused by the plane's movement revealed direction. This is the Doppler effect, the same phenomenon that makes a siren sound different as it approaches or recedes. If the aircraft was moving toward the satellite, the radio signal would be compressed, increasing in frequency. If moving away, the signal would be stretched, decreasing in frequency. Measure this shift precisely enough and you can determine whether the aircraft was moving north or south along that circle. Analysts fed this data into computer models. They calculated possible flight paths. They cross-referenced fuel consumption rates, aircraft performance specifications, and wind patterns recorded on the night of the disappearance. They accounted for the weight of the aircraft, the efficiency of the engines at different altitudes, and the atmospheric conditions along various routes. The mathematics pointed south. The aircraft had flown into the Indian Ocean, beyond any hope of landing, until the fuel tanks ran dry and the engines flamed out. The final ping at 8:11 in the morning marked the moment the plane lost power. The satellite received a partial handshake, an incomplete communication that suggested the aircraft's electrical systems were failing. This could mean the engines had stopped. Without engines, the generators that power the aircraft systems would shut down. The plane would lose electrical power, communication systems would die, and the aircraft would begin its final descent. But here is where the physics became uncertain. How did the plane descend? If the pilots were unconscious or dead from hypoxia, the aircraft would have continued flying on autopilot until fuel exhaustion. Then, without power, it would have entered a spiral dive, spinning faster and faster until it hit the ocean at terminal velocity. The impact would have been catastrophic. The aircraft would have shattered into thousands of pieces. The debris field would be small and deep, everything sinking quickly. But if someone was at the controls, if the descent was managed, the scenario changes. A skilled pilot could glide a 777 for significant distances without engine power. They could control the descent rate. They could choose the impact point, and they could attempt a controlled ditching, bringing the aircraft down on the ocean surface as gently as possible. A ditching does not guarantee survival. Water is not soft. At high speed, hitting water is like hitting concrete. But a skilled pilot might keep the aircraft more intact. The wreckage would be larger, easier to find. The debris recovered so far does not definitively answer which scenario occurred. The flaperon showed high-impact damage, but not total destruction. Some interior panels were shattered, others were relatively intact. The evidence is contradictory, which means the descent could have been anything from a controlled ditching attempt to a spiralling plunge. Independent researchers confirmed the Inmarsat analysis. Experts like Richard Godfrey, a retired physicist with decades of experience in satellite communications, worked with publicly available data to verify the calculations. He reached the same conclusions. The plane had gone south. Victor Ianello, an engineer specializing in signal analysis, also examined the data independently. He found no errors in Inmarsat's work. The physics worked. The plane had flown into the Indian Ocean, but the ocean is vast, and the models could only narrow the search area to thousands of square kilometers. A margin of error measured in hundreds of miles meant the difference between finding wreckage and finding nothing. Small uncertainties in the aircraft's speed, heading, or altitude could shift the projected crash site significantly. If the plane had been flying slightly faster, it would have gone farther south. Slightly slower, and it would have come down farther north. The search teams were looking for a needle in a haystack, except the haystack covered an area larger than some countries, and no one was entirely sure which haystack. Critics argued that the Inmarsat data, while sophisticated, was not infallible. The calculations required assumptions. They assumed the aircraft had flown at constant altitude. They assumed no significant course changes after the final turn south. They assumed the engines performed within normal parameters. Any of these assumptions could be wrong. If the aircraft had climbed or descended, if it had turned east or west, if one engine had failed before the other, the calculations would produce incorrect results. Some ocean current experts noted that the debris recovered from beaches did not match the drift patterns expected if the plane had crashed in the official search zone. They built their own computer models, simulating how floating debris would move through the Indian Ocean. They factored in wind, surface currents, seasonal variations, and the specific buoyancy characteristics of aircraft components. The model suggested the wreckage originated farther north and east, closer to Madagascar, not off the coast of Australia. If true, the entire 3-year search had been conducted in the wrong ocean. The ships had dragged their sonar arrays over the wrong sea floor. The underwater vehicles had photographed the wrong underwater mountains, and Flight 370 remained exactly where it had always been, untouched and undiscovered, waiting for someone to look in the right place. In 2018, a private American company called Ocean Infinity launched a new search. They deployed autonomous underwater vehicles equipped with sophisticated sonar and mapping technology. Unlike earlier searches that used towed arrays, these drones operated independently. They could descend to extreme depths, navigate complex underwater terrain, and scan the ocean floor faster and more efficiently than any previous effort. Ocean Infinity's contract with the Malaysian government was unusual. They would be paid only if they found the wreckage. No find, no fee. It was a gamble, but the company believed their technology gave them an advantage. They covered thousands of square kilometres in months. They found shipwrecks, some from the age of sail. They mapped geological formations that had never been documented. They discovered underwater landscapes of stunning beauty and complexity, canyons and mountains and plains that had existed unseen since the ocean formed. But they did not find Flight 370. The contract expired. The search ended. The ocean kept its secret. Why we cannot let go. The human brain is not wired to accept uncertainty. We are pattern-seeking creatures. We evolved to see cause and effect, to identify threats, and to make sense of our environment. We see faces in clouds. We find constellations in random arrangements of stars. We construct narratives from disconnected events, because stories are how we understand the world. And when something as large and public as a commercial airliner vanishes, Our minds demand an explanation proportional to the event. A mechanical failure feels too mundane. Planes are supposed to be safe. We trust them because they have redundancy, because they are maintained, because accidents are rare and usually explainable. The idea that a simple malfunction could erase 239 people does not match the scale of the tragedy. It feels insufficient. Pilot error feels too simple. Pilots are trained. They are vetted. They go through psychological evaluations and regular check rides. They fly millions of passengers safely every year. The idea that one pilot could deliberately murder hundreds of people clashes with everything we believe about the profession. It makes flying feel dangerous in a way we cannot control. So we want a story that matches the scale of the mystery. We want villains, motives, and hidden agendas. We want someone to blame who is not just a person but an institution, a government, a conspiracy large enough to feel worthy of the loss. Flight 370 offers all of that. The official narrative has gaps large enough to fly a 777 through. Why did the transponder go dark at the exact moment the plane was being handed off between air traffic controllers? The timing was perfect. Too perfect. If someone wanted to disappear a plane, this would be the moment to do it. The gap between controllers, the moment when no one is watching, when responsibility is transferring and everyone assumes someone else is paying attention. Why did the aircraft execute a perfect turn back over Malaysia, threading through radar coverage gaps? The flight path looks deliberate. It looks planned. It follows borders, exploits blind spots, and navigates with precision through some of the most monitored airspace in the world. This is not the wandering track of a doomed aircraft flying on autopilot. This is navigation. Why did no distress call ever come? Pilots are trained to communicate. Aviate, navigate, communicate. Even in emergencies, even when things are falling apart, you try to let someone know what is happening. Flight 370 went silent and stayed silent for 7 hours. That silence is the loudest mystery of all. These are not small questions. They are the foundation of doubt. And when official explanations cannot address them satisfactorily, people stop trusting the narrative. They start looking for alternatives. They start believing that maybe, just maybe, there is more to the story than governments are willing to admit. Governments made it worse. Malaysia withheld radar data for weeks. When they finally released it, the information contradicted earlier statements. They had known from the beginning that the plane had turned back. They had military radar tracks showing the aircraft crossing their country. But they did not share this information with search teams looking in the wrong ocean. Vietnam and Thailand admitted, only later, that their military systems had also tracked the aircraft but did not report it in real time. They saw a plane flying through their airspace without authorization, and they did nothing. No fighter jets scrambled, no alerts issued. The aircraft just flew through, and they watched it go. Australia led a search effort in an area that might have been entirely wrong. They committed ships, personnel, and millions of dollars based on satellite calculations that, while sophisticated, carried significant uncertainty. They found nothing, and then declared the search suspended. They left families with the message that their loved ones were out there somewhere, but not in a place worth continuing to look. China accused Malaysia of incompetence and cover-up. They demanded access to data. They sent their own ships and aircraft to search. They organised family groups and applied diplomatic pressure. But they also controlled the narrative within China, censoring online discussions and managing information flow to prevent panic or political embarrassment. The families of the missing were given conflicting information, false hope, and bureaucratic runarounds. They were told the plane had crashed, then told searchers were still looking for survivors. They were shown debris, then told it might not be from their loved one's aircraft. They were promised transparency, then given redacted reports and classified annexes they could not read. When authorities cannot agree on basic facts, the public stops trusting them. When governments withhold information, people assume the worst. When official explanations do not make sense, alternative theories fill the void. And those theories persist because in some cases they explain the evidence better than the official narrative. History teaches us that institutional deception is not paranoia, it is precedent. Governments have lied about downed airliners before. In 1988, the United States Navy cruiser Vincennes shot down Iran Air Flight 655 over the Persian Gulf, killing 290 people. The initial reports claimed the airliner was descending aggressively toward the ship and had been mistaken for a military aircraft. The Vincennes, operating in a combat zone, fired missiles in self-defense. It was a tragic accident, but understandable given the fog of war. Later investigations revealed the truth was more complicated. The airliner was climbing, not descending. It was transmitting civilian identification signals. It was in a recognised commercial air corridor. The crew of the Vincennes had made catastrophic errors in reading their radar systems, in communicating with each other, and in assessing the threat. And the US government had tried to obscure these errors, to present the incident as a reasonable mistake rather than negligence bordering on criminality. In 1983, Soviet fighters shot down Korean Airlines, Flight 007, after it strayed into restricted airspace near Sakhalin Island. 269 people died. The Soviet Union denied responsibility for days. They claimed they had not fired on the aircraft. Then they admitted they had fired but claimed the aircraft had been on a spy mission, deliberately violating Soviet airspace to gather intelligence. They presented radar tracks and radio intercepts that, they argued, proved the aircraft was not a civilian flight. Investigations eventually revealed it was a navigational error. The pilots had programmed the wrong coordinates into their autopilot. The aircraft had drifted hundreds of miles off course. Soviet air defense, operating under Cold War paranoia and assuming the worst, had shot first and investigated later. The truth took years to emerge, and only after political pressure forced both sides to release classified information. These cases prove that civilian airliners can be downed, that governments can lie, and that the truth can be buried under layers of national security and political expediency. When Flight 370 disappeared, these historical echoes shaped public perception. If it happened before, it could happen again. If they lied then, why? Believe them now. The Snowden revelations added fuel. After 2013, the world knew that intelligence agencies conducted mass surveillance, infiltrated communications networks, and operated with minimal oversight. The NSA collected phone records, emails, and internet traffic on a scale that would have seemed impossible before the leaks. They tapped undersea cables. They compromised encryption standards. They monitored foreign leaders, allies, and their own citizens. The idea that a classified program could remotely hijack an aircraft no longer seemed like science fiction. It seemed like Tuesday. If they can read your emails, if they can listen to your phone calls, if they can track your location in real time, why couldn't they take control of a plane? Trust in institutions eroded, and the void filled with suspicion. The ocean remembers. Stand on a beach in Madagascar and look east. Somewhere beyond the horizon, beneath miles of water, lies the answer to one of the greatest mysteries of the modern age. It is out there. The fuselage, the cockpit, the black boxes that recorded every word and every system failure in the final moments. It exists in the physical world, corroding slowly in salt water and silt, waiting for someone to find it. But the ocean is patient. It does not care about closure. It does not care about grieving families or public inquiries or conspiracy theories. It holds on to its secrets until it chooses to release them, piece by piece, in its own time. And the Indian Ocean is vast beyond comprehension, covering 70 million square kilometres with depths that reach 7,000 metres in some places. It is a realm where human technology is still primitive. We have better maps of Mars than we do of the ocean floor. The pressure at those depths is crushing. 700 times atmospheric pressure. Enough to collapse submarines not specifically designed to withstand it. Equipment fails. Electronics short out. Materials that seem strong on the surface become brittle and weak. The darkness is absolute. No sunlight penetrates beyond a few hundred meters. Everything below that exists in permanent night, a world where vision is useless and sound is king. The official narrative says Flight 370 ran out of fuel and spiraled into the water in a high-speed dive. The force of impact would have been enormous. Aluminum is strong, but not that strong. The fuselage would have crumpled on impact. Wings would have sheared off. The tail section would have separated. The force of hitting water at terminal velocity would have shattered the aircraft into thousands of fragments. The wreckage would have sunk quickly, tumbling through the water column until it settled on the ocean floor. Over time, currents would carry lighter pieces, the fragments that float, across the Indian Ocean. Seat cushions, insulation, plastic components. These would drift on the surface, carried by wind and waves, until eventually washing ashore on distant beaches. Some would drift for years. Ocean currents move slowly but relentlessly. A piece of debris released near Australia could take 18 months to reach Madagascar. The Indian Ocean gyre circulates clockwise, driven by trade winds and the Coriolis effect. Anything floating would eventually be caught in this current system and transported west, across thousands of kilometres of open ocean, until it reached the African coast or the islands scattered across the western Indian Ocean. But what if the descent was controlled? What if someone in the cockpit guided the plane down, ditching it as gently as physics allowed? A controlled water landing like the famous Hudson River event in 2009 keeps the aircraft more intact. Captain Sullenberger put that Airbus down on the river with such precision that the fuselage remained in one piece. Passengers evacuated onto the wings. Everyone survived. It was a miracle of skill and composure. But Hudson River was different. The river is calm. The aircraft was at low altitude and low speed. The conditions were ideal for ditching. The Indian Ocean is not calm. Waves reach heights that can swallow ships. The surface is constantly moving, rising and falling with swells that can be 12 feet high even on a good day. Touching down on moving water is like landing on a highway, where the pavement is jumping up and down. The timing has to be perfect. One wingtip hits a wave crest while the other is in a trough, and the aircraft cartwheels, disintegrating instantly. If Flight 370 attempted a controlled ditching, the pilot would have needed extraordinary skill and luck. Lower the landing gear to slow down, but not so much that the gear catches and rips off. Keep the wings level despite the waves. Touch down at the lowest possible speed while maintaining enough control authority to keep the nose up. Even if everything went perfectly, the aircraft would still have taken massive damage. The belly would have ruptured. Water would have flooded in within seconds. The plane would sink in minutes. But it would sink slower than a high-speed crash. It would stay more recognisable. If Flight 370 went down that way, the wreckage would be larger, more concentrated, and potentially easier to find. The fuselage might have remained relatively intact, settling onto the ocean floor as a recognisable shape rather than scattered fragments. The black boxes, designed to survive impact and immersion, would still be attached to the tail section. They would still be broadcasting their locator pings, those ultrasonic signals that search equipment can detect from several kilometres away. Except the batteries in those locator beacons only last about 30 days. After that, they go silent. By the time search teams arrived in the right general area, the beacons had stopped transmitting. The wreckage became just another feature of the ocean floor, indistinguishable from rock formations or coral, structures or the countless other objects resting in the deep. The fragments recovered so far suggest violent structural failure. The flaperon showed damage consistent with high-speed impact. The edges were torn, not cut. The composite materials had shattered rather than bending. Interior panels were shattered. The honeycomb structure collapsed by force. But without the main wreckage, without the black boxes, the evidence is incomplete. We are trying to reconstruct a crime scene with less than 1% of the puzzle pieces. A control ditching also means something more disturbing. It means consciousness, decision-making, and intent. It means whoever was at the controls was still there at the end, still flying the plane, still making choices. It means they guided the aircraft to the most remote part of the ocean deliberately, ensuring that even if the wreckage was found, it would take years or decades. It means they wanted the plane to disappear. The families left behind, 239 people boarded Flight 370. They carried passports, phones, wallets, photographs and plans. Some were travelling for business, some were going home, some were starting vacations. They had families who expected to hear from them after landing, parents waiting for calls, children expecting their mum or dad to return, spouses holding on to boarding passes and text messages, the last scraps of communication before silence. Philip Wood was supposed to meet his partner Sarah Bache in Beijing. They had been planning to move in together. He had sent her a message before boarding, something casual, something about seeing her soon. That message became the last record of his voice. Sarah spent years searching for answers, attending press conferences, confronting Malaysian officials, and refusing to accept that he was simply gone without explanation. The families of the Freescale Semiconductor employees faced a different kind of grief. Their loved ones had been travelling as a group, colleagues and friends who worked together daily. The families knew each other. They had attended company picnics and holiday parties. Now they gathered not for celebration but for memorial services. They created support networks, sharing information and theories, trying to find meaning in a tragedy that offered none. The Chinese families who made up the majority of passengers organised themselves into advocacy groups. They held protests outside the Malaysian embassy in Beijing, demanding transparency and accountability. They hired lawyers to sue the airline. They crowdfunded independent investigations. Some believed their loved ones had been murdered, not lost to an accident. They demanded the government treat the disappearance as a criminal case, not a simple crash. When the plane did not arrive, those families entered a kind of purgatory. Their loved ones were not confirmed dead because no bodies were recovered. But they were not alive because the plane had vanished. Grief without closure is a special kind of torment. It does not allow you to move on because there is always the possibility, however small, that the official story is wrong, that somewhere, somehow, the person you lost might still exist. Death is final. Death brings pain, but it also brings certainty. You can mourn. You can bury the body. You can begin the slow process of healing. But when someone disappears, when they simply cease to exist without evidence, the mind cannot close the door. It keeps the possibility alive. Maybe they survived the crash. Maybe they are on an island somewhere. Maybe the plane landed and they are being held captive. These thoughts are irrational, but grief is not rational. The Chinese government organised support groups for the families of Chinese passengers. They held memorials, provided counselling, and pressured Malaysian authorities for answers. But they also controlled the narrative within China. Online discussions about the disappearance were monitored and sometimes censored. Conspiracy theories that blamed the Chinese government or suggested the passengers were still alive were removed. The state wanted grief to be orderly, contained, and directed toward Malaysia, not toward Beijing. Some families accused Malaysia of criminal negligence. The delayed response, the contradictory statements, the withheld radar data all suggested incompetence at best and cover-up at worst. They demanded criminal charges against air traffic controllers, against Malaysian Airlines executives, against anyone who might be held responsible for what they saw as preventable deaths. Others believed their loved ones had been murdered, not lost to an accident. They demanded investigations, transparency, and accountability. What they received were press conferences, reports, and platitudes. Officials spoke in carefully rehearsed sentences. They expressed sympathy. They promised continued efforts. But they offered no answers, no bodies, and no justice. Conspiracy theories, for the families, were not abstract intellectual exercises. They were lifelines. If the plane had been taken, their loved ones might still be alive. If there was a cover-up, there might be justice. The alternative, that random catastrophe had simply erased the people they loved, offered nothing to hold on to, and so they clung to possibilities, no matter how unlikely, because the human heart needs hope, even when hope is irrational. 10 years later, some families still search. They organise independent investigations, they crowdfund search efforts, they analyse ocean currents and drift models, they correspond with retired aviation experts and amateur researchers. They refuse to accept that the answer is we do not know and never will. Because for them, the missing are not a cold case. They are parents, children, friends, and partners who deserve to be found. Grace Nathan lost her mother on Flight 370. She has spent the decade since becoming an advocate for families of the missing. She attends conferences. She speaks to journalists. She pressures governments to continue searching. She has become an expert in satellite analysis, ocean current modelling, and aviation investigation procedures. She did not choose this expertise. It was forced upon her by the refusal of authorities to provide answers. She learned because no one else would do it for her. There are dozens like her. Family members who transformed grief into action, who refused to be placated by official statements, who learned the technical details of aircraft systems and search methodologies because they needed to understand what happened. They are amateur investigators driven by love and loss. And they will not stop searching because stopping means accepting that their loved ones are gone forever, without explanation. The final accounting. On March 8th, 2014, at 12:41 in the morning, a Boeing 777 departed Kuala Lumpur for Beijing. At 8:11 that morning, it sent its last signal to a satellite. In the hours between, someone or something redirected the aircraft, disabled its communication systems, and flew it into one of the most remote parts of the planet. The official investigation concluded that manual intervention was responsible, but could not identify who or why. The search for wreckage became the most expensive in aviation history and found almost nothing. The families of the missing were left without answers, without bodies, and without closure. The conspiracy theories emerged because the gaps in the official story were too large to ignore. Every alternative explanation, from pilot suicide to remote hijacking to military interception, attempted to impose logic on the void. Some theories were plausible, others were absurd, but all of them shared a common origin: the refusal to accept that the world's most advanced aviation infrastructure could lose an aircraft and never recover it. What we know is this. Flight 370 flew for nearly 7 hours after disappearing from civilian radar. It crossed Malaysia, turned northwest, then south. It flew over open ocean until fuel exhaustion. Debris confirmed to be from the aircraft washed ashore across the western Indian Ocean. The satellite data proves the plane went south. The fragments prove it crashed. The plane is gone. The people are gone. The answers are still out there, somewhere beneath the waves, waiting. What we do not know is why. We do not know who made the decision to turn the plane around. We do not know if it was one person or many. We do not know if it was planned or impulsive, political or personal, malicious or desperate. We do not know if the passengers died quickly from hypoxia or spent hours terrified in the dark. We do not know if the cockpit was locked, if there was a struggle, if anyone tried to stop what was happening. We do not know because the ocean does not give up its secrets easily. The search officially ended in January of 2017. The case remains open. The families still grieve. The wreckage still lies somewhere in the dark, untouched and undiscovered. And the theories persist because mysteries this profound do not die. They evolve, adapt, and take on new life with each unanswered question. Flight 3. 70 vanished, but its ghost remains, in the forums where researchers argue over satellite data, in the dreams of families who lost someone that night, in the warnings issued by aviation authorities who now know that a plane can simply disappear, and the world may never find it. The ocean holds the truth, and it is not ready to let go. Some mysteries are solved with evidence and investigation. Others are solved only with time, when the ocean finally erodes the wreckage enough for it to surface, or when someone stumbles across the debris field by accident. And some mysteries are never solved at all. They remain open wounds in the historical record, questions without answers, tragedies without closure. Flight 3. 70 is all of those things. It is a disappearance that defies explanation, a disaster that left no wreckage in the place anyone expected to find it, a crime scene with no crime that can be proven, a ghost story written in satellite data and ocean currents, and it remains, 10 years later, the plane that the world could not find and cannot forget. The sea knows what happened. The sea watched it fall, but the sea does not speak, and we are left with silence, fragments, and the terrible knowledge that 239 people left the ground and never returned. The only certainty is this: somewhere beneath the Indian Ocean, in water too deep and too dark for light to reach, the answer still waits. It has been waiting for 10 years. It will wait for as many more as it takes, because the ocean is patient, and the truth, however buried, does not cease to exist. It simply remains unfound.